There is a letter that was never meant to be read. It was written in pencil, on a single sheet of paper, in the quiet hours before the largest seaborne invasion in the history of armed conflict. The man who wrote it was not a king, not a politician, not a figure born into power or privilege. He was the son of a Kansas mechanic, raised in a house without running water, who had spent decades of his life passed over, overlooked, and assigned to desks, while other men chased glory. And now, on the eve of a day that would decide the fate of nations, he sat alone with his thoughts and prepared a statement he hoped he would never have to deliver. The letter accepted full responsibility for failure, not partial responsibility, not shared responsibility, his, alone. If the soldiers drowned in the channel, if the paratroopers were cut to pieces in the dark, if the beaches held and the Nazi war machine threw the Allies back into the sea, the fault, he wrote, was his and his alone. Every decision that led to that moment had been his decision. Every calculation, every compromise, every gamble with hundreds of thousands of lives, his. He folded the letter, put it in his pocket, and then went back to work. That man was Dwight David Eisenhower, and if you have never fully understood what he was, what he built, what he carried, you are not alone, because history has a habit of flattening complicated men into comfortable monuments, and Eisenhower, more than almost anyone of his era, became a monument before the world had properly studied him. We think we know him, the bald, smiling grandfather figure, the president who played golf, the general who won the war, the face on the coin. But there is another Eisenhower, the one who grew up poor in a small prairie town, the third of 7 brothers, sleeping in a house where faith was strict and money was scarce. The one who watched his peers earn medals and battlefield commands while he was assigned to train troops stateside, year after year, war after war, promotion after agonizing promotion that never seemed to arrive. The one who was told, more than once, that his best years were probably behind him. The one who was 51 years old before he heard a single shot fired in anger in his direction. That Eisenhower is the one worth knowing, because the journey from that kitchen in Abilene, Kansas, to the map rooms of Allied High Command is not a simple story of talent rewarded. It is a story of patience pressed almost to the point of breaking, of character tested in silence rather than on the battlefield, of a man who built himself so thoroughly in obscurity that when the world finally needed him, he was ready in a way that no one who had lived a more celebrated life could have been. This documentary traces that journey from the beginning. From the frontier town where he grew up, through the decades of postings that went nowhere, through the blunders of his first command and the hard lessons of coalition warfare and impossible politics, all the way through Normandy, through the liberation of a continent, through the corridors of the White House, and finally, to a cold January afternoon in 1961, when an old soldier stood before America and warned it, with genuine urgency, about the very machinery of war that had made him famous. We will not skip the difficult parts, the arguments with Bernard Montgomery that nearly fractured the Allied coalition, the decisions about Berlin that earned him criticism from every direction, the moments when the weight of command was not cinematic or noble, but simply grinding and lonely, and without any clean answer available. Those moments matter. They are, in many ways, the whole point, because leadership, real leadership, the kind that does not exist in textbooks or campaign slogans, is almost never exercised in the bright light of a clear moral choice. It is almost always exercised in the gray hour, in the space between bad and worse, by someone who will carry the outcome either way. Eisenhower understood that. He understood it more deeply than most, because he had spent so long being nobody, watching the war from the sidelines, that when responsibility finally arrived, he did not flinch from its full weight. He picked it up, all of it. There is something in that story for anyone who has ever felt overlooked. Anyone who has watched less capable people advance while you were asked, again, to wait. Anyone who has done the unglamorous work, filed the reports no one reads, sat in the meetings no one remembers, and wondered whether any of it would ever amount to something. Eisenhower's answer to that question, the answer he lived rather than the one he ever stated, was patient, stubborn, and ultimately undeniable. It amounts to everything. The preparation is the point. The obscurity is the training ground. By the time the world needed someone who could hold together a coalition of enormous egos, competing national interests, generals who despised one another, politicians who distrusted the military, and an American public that had not fought a major land war in Europe within living memory, by the time all of that was required simultaneously, in the middle of the most destructive conflict humanity had ever waged, there was one man on earth who had quietly and almost accidentally prepared himself for exactly that task, not through heroism, not through battlefield brilliance, but through decades of learning how institutions work, how people work, how power works, and how to hold all of it together without letting the seams show. That man had grown up without running water in Abilene, Kansas. And if that does not make you want to settle in and hear the whole story, then we are not sure what will. So here is what we ask of you. Find a comfortable position. Let the hours ahead belong to this, because this is not a short story and it is not a simple one, and it deserves the space to breathe. There are 18 chapters waiting for you, from a boy on the Kansas frontier to an old man at Gettysburg, from a house without plumbing to the most powerful office on the planet, and every chapter earns the one that follows. This is the complete history of Dwight David Eisenhower. You have found the right place to hear it. If this kind of long-form history is what keeps you company through the night, consider subscribing. There is much more where this is coming from, and every story we tell is given the same care and the same time that a story this size demands. Now, let us go back to the beginning, back to a small house in a small town, in a country that was still figuring out what it was, back to a boy who had no idea what was coming, and a mother who prayed it would not be war, and a world that had not yet decided what it needed from him. Back to Abilene. There is a place in the American heartland where the sky does not merely exist above you, it surrounds you. The plains of Kansas stretch in every direction without apology, flat and vast and indifferent to the ambitions of the people who scratch their lives into the soil beneath them. The wind comes without warning, and the summers are merciless, and the winters demand something from a person that only the land itself can teach. It was into this world, or very nearly it, that the man who would one day command the greatest military alliance in human history first drew breath. He was born not in Kansas but in Denison, Texas, in the autumn of 1890, the third son of a family whose prospects at that moment were as spare as the landscape around them. His father, David, had followed work south after a business venture in Kansas failed and left the family without foundation. His mother, Ida, carried the family's spirit when material circumstances could not. The boy they named Dwight David Eisenhower arrived into a household defined not by comfort, but by character, not by wealth, but by will. The failure in Kansas that had driven David Eisenhower to Texas was not a small thing for a proud man to carry. He had put his faith in a small general store partnership in the town of Hope, and the venture had collapsed beneath him before it had any real chance to breathe. He moved his young family south to Denison and took work on the railroad, and it was there, in a modest house near the tracks where the ground shook with passing freight, that Dwight was born. The family did not linger in Texas long. Within a year of his birth, the Eisenhowers were drawn back north by the offer of work at a creamery in Abilene, Kansas, operated by a religious community with which Ida's family had deep ties. Abilene would become the true beginning of the story. It would become home in the way that only the place of your formative years can be, not merely where you lived, but where you were made. Abilene in those years was a town in transition. It had once been the roaring terminus of the Chisholm Trail, a cattle town where money and violence arrived together on the back of the long drives from Texas. By the time the Eisenhower family settled there, that era had passed. The cattle were gone, The drovers were gone. The particular wildness that had made Abilene famous in dime novels and cautionary sermons had faded into memory. What remained was a quieter place, a farming and milling community trying to find its permanent shape. But the residue of that frontier history lingered in the culture of the town, in the directness of its people, in the sense that life was something you contested rather than merely received. Growing up in Abilene meant growing up in the long shroud of a recent and vivid American past, and that meant something to a boy with an imagination and a hunger to prove himself. The Eisenhower home on the south side of town was small, and it sheltered a family that grew to include 6 boys who survived to adulthood. David worked long hours at the creamery, and the family supplemented what little income he brought home with a large vegetable garden, chickens, and a cow. There was no luxury and no slack. Every member of the household contributed to its functioning from an early age, and the boys understood without being told explicitly that comfort was something you earned rather than something you inherited. This was not a household given to complaint. Ida ran it with quiet efficiency and a deep spiritual conviction that transformed scarcity into something almost principled, as though the absence of excess was itself a form of virtue. The boys were fed, clothed, educated, and expected to behave with integrity. By the standards of many families around them, they had enough, and Ida made certain they understood that enough was not a small thing. It was Ida who gave the household its moral architecture, and her influence on Dwight would prove to be among the most durable forces of his life. She was a woman of genuine and searching faith, a member of the River Brethren, a pacifist religious movement that placed the rejection of violence at the center of its practice. This created a tension in the Eisenhower home that would only deepen as her sons grew, and the youngest of them fixed his attention on military service. Ida did not rage against her son's ambitions, but she did not pretend that they sat easily with her beliefs. She was a woman who read scripture daily, who kept the home free of profanity, and who met the considerable hardships of her life with an equanimity that her son would later describe as the most impressive quality he had ever witnessed in any human being. Her pacifism was not weakness. It was a considered position arrived at through genuine conviction, and Dwight understood it as such even when he chose a different path. David Eisenhower was a quieter presence in the household, more inward than his wife, a man whose early failure had left a mark that did not fully fade. He had studied at a small college with some ambition toward engineering, and he read voraciously, filling the modest family bookshelves with volumes on history and mechanics that his sons inherited as a kind of intellectual environment. He was strict and he was reserved, and he was not a man who offered praise as a substitute for standards. His sons respected him without always finding warmth easily accessible in him. What David gave his children was a sense that the world was larger than Abilene, that ideas mattered, and that a man's character was the only currency that held its value over time. These were not formal lessons. They were the air the Eisenhower boys breathed. Among 6 brothers, Dwight occupied a middle position that required him to be both younger and older, both follower and leader, depending on the hour and the circumstance. The boys were a presence in Abilene, active, competitive, and known. They played hard and they fought when they had to, and the south side of town where they lived was considered the rougher territory, the part of Abilene across the tracks from the families of doctors and merchants and lawyers. The north-south divide in Abilene was not dramatic by any urban measure, but for boys it was real and it was felt, and crossing it meant entering territory where your standing had to be established again from nothing. Dwight learned early that you could not choose the circumstances of where you started, but you could choose how you carried yourself once you were there. He learned also that anger, while powerful, was most useful when it was managed rather than merely expressed. His temper was a thing he had to contend with, and he was honest about it in later life. There were moments in his boyhood when rage overtook him, fists swung at older boys twice his size, confrontations that began in the particular injustice that only a child can feel with full intensity, and ended with blood and bruised pride. His mother handled these episodes not with punishment alone, but with something more penetrating, the observation that a man who cannot master himself cannot master anything else. She would sit with him after an outburst and speak to him about the uselessness of rage, about the difference between strength and violence, about what it meant to be genuinely powerful as opposed to merely loud. These conversations lodged somewhere deep in Dwight Eisenhower's character and would surface decades later in the way he managed rooms full of generals who disagreed, in the way he absorbed criticism from Churchill and Montgomery without allowing it to become personal warfare. He was a bright student in the way that practical intelligence tends to express itself, not through effortless academic performance, but through genuine curiosity and the ability to reason about real problems. History captivated him completely. He absorbed books on military history the way other boys consumed adventure stories, and for him, they were adventure stories, but stories with the additional appeal of craft and strategy, of problems to be solved under conditions of extreme pressure. He was drawn not merely to the drama of battles, but to the questions of how decisions were made, why certain commanders succeeded and others failed, what separated the competent from the genuinely great. These were not idle fascinations. They were the early stirrings of a mind that would spend its most productive decades grappling with exactly those questions at the highest possible stakes. When the idea of attending the United States Military Academy at West Point began to take shape in Eisenhower's thinking, it carried with it the practical appeal that military education was free. For a boy from the south side of Abilene, the cost of higher education was not a theoretical consideration. It was the wall between one future and another. West Point offered both education and purpose, and the two together were irresistible. His mother's pacifism meant that her heart was not with this choice, but she held herself with the same quiet discipline she asked of her sons. She did not stand in his way. She trusted, perhaps, that whatever convictions she had given him would travel with him wherever he went, even into a world organized entirely around the instruments of war. Her faith in her son was its own form of courage. He left Abilene in 1911 as a young man of 20, lean and confident, and carrying within him everything that the plains and the poverty and the discipline and the faith of that small Kansas town had deposited in him over 2 decades. The boy who had grown up reading military history by lamplight, who had absorbed his father's quiet insistence on intellectual seriousness and his mother's fierce conviction that character was non-negotiable, who had learned to manage his own temper through sheer determination. That boy was about to become something else. He was about to become a soldier. And while no one standing on the platform as he departed Abilene could have articulated precisely what that would mean for the world, there was something in the straightness of his posture and the steadiness of his gaze that suggested this particular young man was heading somewhere that the rest of them could not yet quite see. The summer of 1911 was hot, even by Kansas standards. A young man from Abilene stepped off a train and into a world that ran on precision, protocol, and the unforgiving weight of expectation. The United States Military Academy at West Point sat high above the Hudson River, its gray stone buildings rising like a medieval fortress against the New York sky. For a boy who had grown up in a modest clapboard house on the edge of the frontier, the sheer scale of the place must have carried a kind of quiet shock. Everything here was ordered, intentional, ancient in its own American way. The lawns were cut to a standard. The days were divided into blocks of time that left no room for uncertainty. And somewhere among the hundreds of young men milling in their new gray uniforms, a 20-year-old Eisenhower found himself at the bottom of a very tall mountain. Getting to West Point had not been straightforward. Abilene was not a town that produced military officers with any regularity, and Eisenhower's family, shaped by his mother Ida's deep pacifist convictions, had no particular tradition of military service to offer as a guide. His original ambition had leaned toward Annapolis and the Naval Academy, but his age made him ineligible for that path by the time the opportunity arrived. A competitive examination for appointments to both West Point and Annapolis opened a door instead, and Eisenhower sat for it with the same focused determination he had shown on the football fields of Abilene. He placed near the top. A congressional appointment followed, and with it the weight of becoming the first member of his family to attend a federal military academy. His mother, by some accounts, wept when he left, not from pride alone, but from a grief that her faith in nonviolence could not quite reconcile with the road her son had chosen. West Point, in 1911, was an institution still carrying the long shroud of its Civil War legacy. The names carved into its halls were names that had led armies into catastrophe and glory. The teaching methods were traditional to the point of rigidity, heavily rooted in mathematics, engineering, and the memorization of tactical doctrine. Cadets were not invited to question the curriculum. They were expected to absorb it, repeat it, and perform it under conditions designed to strip away any comfort they had carried through the gates. For Eisenhower, the academic side of this bargain proved harder than expected. He was not a poor student, but he was not a distinguished one either. Mathematics gave him trouble in stretches. His overall academic standing placed him in the middle range of his class. Competent, steady, but hardly the kind of record that turned heads among faculty reviewers scanning for future generals. What the record books did not easily capture was the quality of the man those years were building. Where Eisenhower struggled in the lecture hall, he flourished everywhere else. His peers noticed something in him that defied the standard metrics of cadet evaluation. He carried himself with an ease of authority, not arrogance, but a natural gravity that made people listen when he spoke and follow when he moved. He could enter a room where tension was already running high and lower the temperature simply by being present. His smile, already becoming the famous thing it would one day be, was not a social performance. It was a genuine expression of a man who genuinely liked people, who found them interesting, who wanted to understand them, and who gave them the sense that they mattered to him personally. That quality was rare at any institution. At West Point, where competition and hierarchy ruled every interaction, it was almost singular. Football became his proving ground in ways that no classroom could have offered. Eisenhower threw himself into the sport with an intensity that bordered on reckless, and for a time it appeared he might build a reputation on the athletic fields rather than the parade grounds. He was fast, physical, and willing, qualities that earned him a position on the varsity squad and the attention of coaches who saw a genuinely promising player. For 2 seasons he pushed himself hard, absorbing contact, playing through discomfort, building the kind of physical confidence that comes only from repeatedly choosing not to quit. Then a knee injury arrived and ended it with the sudden finality that only sport can deliver. He was ordered off the field and told his playing days were over. The blow was not small. By multiple accounts, those who knew him during that period said the loss of football hit him harder than almost anything else the academy had thrown at him. He spent time visibly low, stripped of something that had given him a sense of purpose and kinetic release. But what the injury took from him in one direction, it quietly gave in another. Without the time and energy consumed by practice and competition, Eisenhower turned more fully toward his fellow cadets, toward the human architecture of the institution he was living inside. He became someone people sought out, not for answers to mathematical problems, but for counsel, perspective, and the kind of steady companionship that young men far from home genuinely needed. He coached junior players from the sidelines, studying the game from a position of observation he had never needed before. Some historians have drawn a straight line from that enforced stillness, that shift from participant to analyst, to the command philosophy he would carry into the Second World War. Whether the line is that clean is debatable. What is not debatable is that the injury changed his relationship to leadership, making it more deliberate, more considered, and more deeply relational. The friendships Eisenhower formed at West Point were not casual. They were the forged, tested kind that form only under shared hardship, and they would carry extraordinary consequences in the decades ahead. Among his classmates were men who would go on to hold some of the most significant commands in the United States military. They trained together, competed together, suffered the same humiliations and the same small triumphs that West Point dispenses with impartial efficiency. These were not simply men who attended the same institution. They were men who understood one another at the level of character, who had seen each other at their worst and their most disciplined, and who carried that knowledge forward into the pressure of global conflict. The value of those bonds cannot be overstated. In a war fought on multiple continents between commanders with colossal egos and competing national interests, Eisenhower's ability to walk into a room and speak to men who already trusted him at a fundamental level would matter enormously. His conduct record at West Point told its own quiet story. He accumulated demerits at a rate that suggested a young man who was not always inclined to treat minor regulations with the reverence the institution expected. Nothing catastrophic, no single act of serious insubordination, but a pattern of small infractions that reflected a personality that respected the purpose behind rules more than the rules themselves. He was not rebellious in any philosophical sense. He was simply practical. If a regulation existed for a clear reason, he observed it carefully. If it appeared to exist purely for the sake of existing, his compliance had a certain looseness about it. That distinction between the spirit of an order and its letter would become a hallmark of the commander he was becoming, a man who could follow a directive from above while exercising meaningful judgment in its application. The curriculum itself, despite its limitations, was shaping something important in him. The engineering emphasis gave him a structural way of thinking about problems, the habit of breaking a complex challenge into its component parts, identifying the load-bearing elements, and working systematically from foundation to resolution. The tactical instruction, even where it felt dated, drilled into him a vocabulary for military thinking that would serve as shared language in every command discussion he would later enter. He was learning how to read a map and how to read a room in the same years, and both skills were accumulating toward something that would not become fully visible for another 3 decades. West Point was not yet producing a great general. It was producing a man capable of becoming one, which is an entirely different and more difficult thing. By the time graduation approached in the spring of 1915, Eisenhower stood in a class that would come to carry an extraordinary distinction. The class of 1915 would eventually produce more generals of high rank than almost any other in the Academy's history, a distinction that would later earn them a name that spoke to both their promise and their cost. Eisenhower graduated in the middle of his class, his academic record unremarkable by the standards of those ranking near the top. He received his commission as a second lieutenant in the United States Army. He was 24 years old, about to enter a peacetime army in a nation that had not yet fought a significant war in nearly 2 decades, and whose political instincts still ran strongly toward staying out of the ones that were already burning across Europe. He left West Point carrying less than some of his peers in terms of academic honors, and more than most in terms of the invisible material that West Point, at its best, actually produces. He had arrived as a boy from Kansas, with large ambitions and limited certainty about how to realize them. He was leaving as an officer, one whose name appeared nowhere in particular on any list that mattered in 1915, but who had built inside himself something that lists could not measure. He knew how to hold the loyalty of people who had no reason to give it easily. He knew how to absorb a defeat and return to the field. He knew that the work of leadership is mostly quiet, mostly unglamorous, and mostly done in the space between the public moments that history eventually remembers. He did not know yet how long he would have to wait for those moments. That knowledge was still ahead of him, measured in decades of patience that even West Point had not fully prepared him for. He had survived West Point. He had earned his commission, shaken the hands of men who would go on to become legends, and walked out of those gray stone gates with his uniform pressed and his ambitions fixed firmly on the horizon. But the horizon, it turned out, was a long way off. The years that followed his graduation were not the years of fire and consequence he had imagined during those long evenings on the plain above the Hudson. They were years of paperwork and routine, of damp postings and slow promotions, of watching the world move without him. The Army in peacetime was a different creature entirely. lean, underfunded, and largely ignored by a nation that had decided it was finished with war. For Eisenhower, those years would ask a question that no classroom or parade ground ever could. What does a man do with himself when history refuses to call his name? His first postings kept him close to home, stationed at Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, Texas, where the days followed each other in a comfortable and uneventful procession. It was there, in 1915, that he met Mamie Geneva Dowd, a vivacious 19-year-old from a prosperous Denver family who had little intention of spending her life trailing a soldier from one forgotten garrison to the next. He fell for her immediately and completely. They married the following year, and from that point forward, Mamie became the fixed point around which every upheaval in his career would orbit. She was patient, sharper than she was given credit for, and she asked only that he be honest with her about what the life would demand. He could not always spare her the hardships, but he never stopped trying. Their marriage would endure decades and distances that would have broken less resilient bonds, and it began here, in the Texas heat, before the world had any idea who either of them was. When America entered the First World War in 1917, Eisenhower's contemporaries began moving toward the front with a momentum that left him standing on the platform. He requested deployment to France multiple times. Each request was denied. Instead, the Army recognized something in him that he himself had not yet fully come to terms with: an administrative gift, a talent for organizing large numbers of men and complex logistics with a clarity that was genuinely rare. He was given command of a tank training battalion at Camp Colt, Pennsylvania, operating out of the very ground where the Battle of Gettysburg had been fought half a century before. He threw himself into the work with everything he had. He trained thousands of men in the use of equipment that had barely arrived, navigated supply shortages, managed morale through a deadly influenza outbreak, and ran his camp with a precision that earned him his first serious commendations. The armistice came in November of 1918, and with it came the bitter knowledge that he had been good at preparing others to fight a war he never got to fight himself. The years between the wars settled over the American military like a long frost. Budgets were slashed, promotions froze. Officers who had held the rank of colonel during the fighting found themselves reverting to captain, and the entire institution contracted around a peacetime logic that seemed to assume war was an embarrassing episode now safely behind civilization. Eisenhower moved through this landscape without complaint, at least outwardly, but those who knew him well enough understood what it cost him. He had been a captain for a stretch of years that strained the definition of patience. His pay was modest, his quarters were often cramped, and the Army's peacetime culture rewarded seniority over talent with a consistency that could grind ambition down to something unrecognizable. He played cards, he read military history obsessively, he cooked, he golfed, and he kept his frustrations largely to himself. His posting to Panama in the early 1920s placed him under General Fox Connor, and this particular assignment would prove to be one of the most consequential accidents of his career. Connor was a man of unusual intellectual depth for a military officer, a serious student of history, strategy, and the mechanics of how great commanders had thought. He recognized in Eisenhower a mind that was being systematically wasted, and he proceeded to do something about it. For roughly 2 years in that jungle climate, Connor put Eisenhower through what amounted to a private graduate education in warfare. He assigned him books: Clausewitz, military biography, European campaign histories, and then argued with him about what he had read. He made him think about coalition warfare, about the political dimensions of military command, about the difference between tactical competence and genuine strategic vision. Eisenhower later described Connor as the most influential figure in his professional development, and there is nothing in the record to suggest that was an exaggeration. Returning stateside, Eisenhower graduated first in his class from the Command and General Staff School at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, in 1926, a result that turned heads among those who paid attention to such things, which in the peacetime Army was not yet very many. He went on to the Army War College, continued to accumulate the credentials of a serious officer, and began writing military analyses that demonstrated a synthetic intelligence rarely found in career bureaucrats. He could look at a strategic problem, strip it to its essential components, and produce a clear and actionable response in less time than most of his colleagues needed to understand the question. This was a skill the Army valued in theory and underused in practice, and Eisenhower spent considerable energy during these years doing precisely that, being valued in theory while being underused in practice. His assignment to work under General Douglas MacArthur in Washington in the early 1930s introduced him to the most complicated professional relationship of his life. MacArthur was brilliant, theatrical, and almost constitutionally incapable of tolerating anyone in his orbit who was not wholly subordinate or wholly worshipful. Eisenhower was neither. He was capable, meticulous, and privately unimpressed by the performance of greatness, when greatness was not clearly earned. The two men worked together in a productive tension that neither would later describe with much warmth. When MacArthur was asked by the Philippine government to build a military defense force and accepted with characteristic grandeur, he brought Eisenhower along with him. They arrived in Manila in 1935, and Eisenhower spent the next several years attempting to construct an effective military establishment for a nation with limited resources, a complicated colonial history, and an approach to military preparation that MacArthur found inspiring, and Eisenhower found maddening. The Philippines were not without compensations. The climate suited him less than he admitted, but the complexity of the task suited him more than he let on. Building something from very little, managing relationships between competing political interests, allocating scarce resources against an impossible set of requirements. These were exactly the kinds of problems his mind was designed to solve, even if they came with no glory attached. He worried about the strategic situation. He could read the gathering pressure in the Pacific, could see what Japanese imperial expansion was pointing toward, and he grew increasingly impatient with the magical thinking that seemed to pervade official assessments of the region's security. His private correspondence from these years reveals a man who is professionally engaged but quietly alarmed, doing his job with diligence while watching the larger picture deteriorate. He finally left the Philippines in 1939, the same year Germany rolled into Poland and proved that the frost on European civilization had been somewhat more structural than its politicians had wished to believe. Eisenhower returned to a United States that was still formally at peace, but beginning to move, in fits and starts, toward the uncomfortable recognition that neutrality had a time limit. He took up a series of stateside commands, and his reputation as an organizational mind of the first order began traveling ahead of him through the channels of Army gossip and formal assessment that determined which officers ended up in which rooms. He was 50 years old, or close enough that the distance barely mattered, and he had never commanded troops in actual combat. His peers who had served in France carried a currency he simply did not possess. He was aware of this. He was aware of it in the specific and daily way that a man is aware of a debt he has not yet found a way to repay. The Louisiana maneuvers of 1941 were the largest peacetime military exercises in American history to that point, involving hundreds of thousands of troops across a geography of swamp and forest that punished poor logistics with an almost pedagogical precision. Eisenhower served as Chief of Staff for the Third Army under General Walter Kruger, and his performance during those exercises was, by any measure, exceptional. He managed the movement of massive formations, solved supply problems in real time, and demonstrated that his 30 years of accumulated administrative knowledge could translate into genuine operational effectiveness when the scale was large enough to require it. Journalists and senior officers noticed. His name began appearing in the newspapers, which in the American military culture of 1941 was a form of professional recognition with consequences. General George C. Marshall, the Army's Chief of Staff, was a man who watched officers with a particular quality of attention, patient, unsentimental, and extremely accurate. He had noticed Eisenhower. He had, in fact, been noticing him for some time, building a mental picture of the man from reports and assessments and the quiet testimony of officers whose judgment Marshall trusted. What he saw was not a hero in the conventional mold. He saw something rarer and, in the circumstances that were now bearing down on the United States, considerably more useful. A man who could organize at enormous scale, who could manage political relationships without losing military effectiveness, who could absorb the friction of complex coalition dynamics and still produce coherent strategy. Marshall did not yet know precisely what role Eisenhower would play in the war that was coming, but by the autumn of 1941, he was already keeping that name close. The boy from Abilene had spent nearly 3 decades preparing for something he could not yet name, and the hour, at last, was beginning to move. By the early 1930s, Dwight Eisenhower had spent nearly 2 decades in the Army and had almost nothing to show the world for it. No medals earned under fire, no battlefield commissions, no dispatches from the front, carried breathlessly back to headquarters. What he had, instead, was a stack of efficiency reports that called him brilliant, a series of postings that went nowhere glamorous, and a quiet, grinding sense that the Army was moving without him. His contemporaries, men he had shaken hands with at West Point, men he had outscored in exercises and outthought in classrooms, were accumulating the kind of resume that the Army rewarded. Eisenhower was accumulating experience of a different kind, the kind that nobody noticed until the moment it became the only thing that mattered. He had spent years learning how institutions actually work, not how they appear to work in manuals and doctrine papers, but how they breathe and stall and surge when real pressure is applied. His posting in Panama had taught him logistics under tropical conditions, supply lines that rotted in the heat, equipment that failed at the worst possible moment. His time under General Fox Connor had deepened him intellectually in ways that formal schooling never had. Connor had assigned him the great theorists of war, Clausewitz and Jomini and others, and had demanded that Eisenhower argue with them rather than simply absorb them. That habit of critical engagement, of pressing on assumptions until they either held or gave way, was not the kind of skill that showed up in a battle citation, but it was the kind that built armies from the ground up when the moment finally demanded it. His years in the Philippines under General Douglas MacArthur had been a study in contrasts that Eisenhower would carry for the rest of his life. MacArthur was everything Eisenhower was not: theatrical, imperious, a man who wore his own legend like a second uniform. Working for him was an education in ego as a force of nature, and Eisenhower proved capable of subordinating himself completely to a commander's vision without losing the quiet authority of his own judgment. He drafted speeches, organized a nascent Philippine army, managed budgets that never stretched far enough, and navigated the impossible political tensions between American military ambition and Filipino national pride. It was exhausting, unglamorous work. It was also precisely the kind of work that would define the next great war, and almost nobody in Washington understood that yet. When Eisenhower returned to the continental United States in the late 1930s, the world was beginning to change at a pace that made careful men nervous and reckless men dangerous. Germany had remade itself into a military power that the Treaty of Versailles was supposed to have prevented from ever existing again. Japan was carving through China with a speed and violence that shocked observers who had underestimated the ambition behind it. Europe was sliding toward a general war that Britain and France could feel coming, but could not agree on how to stop. America, for its part, remained officially distant from all of it, wrapped in the complex political fabric of isolationism, still scarred by the memory of the last time it had sent its young men into the mud of European battlefields. But within the Army, men who thought clearly about these things understood that distance was not the same as safety, and that readiness could not be improvised once the moment of crisis had arrived. Eisenhower found himself assigned to Fort Lewis in Washington state, working in field command exercises that he approached with characteristic thoroughness. He was not a man who performed well only when the audience was watching. He worked with the same focused intensity whether anyone of rank was paying attention or not, and that consistency was itself a form of distinction in an institution that could smell the difference between a man who performed and a man who simply was what he appeared to be. The Army's great maneuvers of 1941 would bring that distinction to a head in a way that Eisenhower could not have engineered even if he had tried to engineer it. The Louisiana maneuvers of 1941 were the largest peacetime military exercises in American history up to that point, involving more than 400,000 troops spread across the bayous and flatlands of the American South. They were designed to stress test the Army's capacity for large-scale operations, to find out whether doctrine worked when it met real friction, real terrain, real supply problems, and the thousand small decisions that no field manual could anticipate. Eisenhower served as Chief of Staff to General Walter Kruger's Third Army, and in that role he was essentially the operational brain behind everything Kruger's forces did. He planned, coordinated, improvised, and held the complex machinery of a massive force together under conditions designed to break it. The Third Army performed brilliantly. Correspondents noticed, generals noticed, and one man in particular, watching the results from Washington with the kind of steady attention that never missed what mattered, noticed most of all. General George Catlett Marshall was not a man given to enthusiasm. He was precise, demanding, almost unsettlingly calm, a man who had made it his life's work to understand people with unsparing accuracy and to place them where their abilities would serve the largest possible purpose. Marshall had been named Chief of Staff of the Army in 1939, and he had inherited an institution that was, by the standards of any serious military power, genuinely inadequate for the scale of conflict he could already see approaching. He needed officers who could think at the level of armies and nations rather than battalions and regiments. He needed men who could manage coalitions, absorb political complexity, translate strategic vision into operational reality, and do all of it without losing their composure when everything went wrong at once. He had been quietly building a list of such men for years. After the Louisiana maneuvers, Eisenhower's name moved near the top of it. Their first significant interaction came in the days immediately following Pearl Harbor, in December of 1941, a moment that belongs properly to the next chapter of this story. But the groundwork for that meeting had been laid through months of Marshall watching, evaluating, and concluding. Marshall was not sentimental about military tradition or the seniority system that allowed mediocre men to accumulate rank simply by outlasting better ones. He was willing to reach past decades of service and promote a man based on what he could actually do, which was a radical approach in an institution that often confused longevity with merit. Eisenhower, at 50 years old, had spent most of his career being passed over precisely because the Army had not yet needed what he uniquely offered. Marshall was preparing to need exactly that. What Marshall saw in Eisenhower was not just organizational competence, though that was real and rare enough. It was something harder to name, a quality of judgment that remained stable under pressure, a capacity to hold multiple competing considerations in mind simultaneously, without letting any single one distort the whole picture. Eisenhower could manage difficult personalities without being managed by them. He could absorb setbacks without catastrophizing and successes without losing his grip on the next problem waiting behind the current one. He wrote clearly and thought in a way that translated complexity into action rather than using complexity as a reason for delay. In the kind of war that was coming, a war of coalitions, of industrial scale, of politics threaded through every military decision, those qualities were not supplementary to battlefield courage. They were the thing itself. Through 1941, as the nation edged closer to the edge it would fall over in December, Eisenhower worked within a planning apparatus that was scrambling to imagine a war the country had not yet declared, and an army that was not yet capable of fighting it. The American military of that period was, by the most honest measurement, a skeleton. Its equipment was outdated, its officer corps was thin, Its logistical infrastructure was built for peacetime maintenance rather than global projection. The gap between what existed and what would be required was not a matter of months of preparation. It was a matter of years of organizational transformation on a scale the country had never attempted. Someone would have to plan that transformation. Someone would have to understand it in all its interlocking complexity: manpower, materiel, shipping, training, doctrine, coalition politics, industrial conversion, and hold it together long enough to make it real. Marshall was already certain he knew who that person was. The irony that Eisenhower himself might have appreciated, had he been given to irony of that kind, was that his long years of apparent obscurity had been, in a sense, a preparation precisely calibrated for this moment. Every frustrating posting, every year spent managing impossible budgets and difficult personalities, every night spent reading the theorists that most of his contemporaries considered optional, all of it had been accumulating toward a form of readiness that could not have been manufactured any other way. He had not been waiting in the shroud of other men's careers. He had been building something, even when he could not name what it was or see where it was pointing. Marshall could see it, and in the weeks to come, as the world cracked open on a quiet Sunday morning in Hawaii, Eisenhower would finally be called to use everything the long years had made of him. On the 7th of December 1941, a Sunday morning broke quietly over the Hawaiian island of Oahu. Sailors slept late. Officers attended chapel. The Pacific Fleet lay at anchor in the harbor below Diamond Head, arranged in its rows like a model exhibition, its gray hulls gleaming under the early light. Then, at roughly 7:45 in the morning, the sky filled with aircraft, hundreds of them, carrying the markings of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Within 2 hours, the United States Pacific Fleet had been gutted. More than 2,400 Americans were dead. 5 battleships had been sunk or crippled at their moorings, and a nation that had spent years debating whether to enter the war was debating no longer. The argument was over. America was in it, all of it, with everything it had. More than 4,000 kilometers away, at Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, Texas, Dwight Eisenhower was asleep when the news came through. He had spent the previous weeks buried in the grinding administrative work that had defined his career for nearly 3 decades, planning exercises, drafting reports, managing the enormous logistical puzzle of training an army that barely existed. Word of the attack reached him quickly, as it reached every senior officer that morning, through telephone calls and radio bulletins that carried an almost surreal quality. He dressed, went to his office, and began working. Not because he was ordered to, because that was who he was. While the nation reeled, Eisenhower did what he had always done in crisis. He thought, organized, and prepared. He had spent years being overlooked. His contemporaries had earned their combat records and their headlines, while he had moved from posting to posting, sharpening skills that nobody seemed to need, until the moment they needed them desperately. The Philippines had given him experience in coalition politics and resource scarcity. His work under General Douglas MacArthur had taught him the particular difficulty of serving a commanding personality whose ego consumed the oxygen in every room. His years on the staff had given him something rarer and less celebrated than battlefield glory: a precise, almost architectural understanding of how modern armies were built, supplied, moved, and sustained. Pearl Harbor did not change Eisenhower. It simply created the conditions in which what he already was could finally matter. 6 days after the attack, he received a telephone call from Washington. On the other end of the line was General George C. Marshall, Chief of Staff of the Army, the most powerful military figure in America. Marshall's voice was direct, almost businesslike. He told Eisenhower to report to Washington immediately. What he did not say, but what hung clearly in the air between them, was that the United States was now fighting a 2-ocean war against 2 formidable industrial nations, and that it had almost nothing in place to fight either of them. Marshall needed men who could think at scale. He had been watching Eisenhower for months. Now he was summoning him. Eisenhower packed a single bag, kissed his wife Mamie goodbye, and boarded a train for the capital. He believed he would return to Texas within a few weeks. He would not return for years. Washington, in December of 1941, was a city gripped by a controlled kind of panic. Government buildings worked around the clock. Officers in uniform crowded every corridor of the War Department, phones ringing without pause, maps being unrolled and refolded and unrolled again. When Eisenhower arrived at Marshall's office, the general wasted no time. He laid out the situation in the Pacific, the Philippines under assault, supply lines severed, MacArthur's forces being pressed back, and then he looked directly at Eisenhower and asked him, what should be done? It was, by any measure, an extraordinary test. Most men would have reached for caution. Eisenhower did not hesitate. He said he needed time to think, and he returned within hours with a clear, reasoned assessment. Marshall listened. He said nothing for a moment. Then he told Eisenhower that his conclusions were sound. The working relationship that would shape the war in Europe had just begun. Marshall placed Eisenhower in the War Plans Division almost immediately, and the pace of work became ferocious. The American military in early 1942 was an institution in the process of becoming something. The draft had brought in hundreds of thousands of new soldiers, but they were raw, undertrained, and under-equipped. Industry was converting to war production at a staggering rate, but the machinery of total war takes time to build. Eisenhower understood these constraints with unusual clarity, and he threw himself into the work of building a coherent strategy from the wreckage of pre-war assumptions. He worked 18-hour days as a matter of routine, sleeping on a cot in his office when the schedule demanded it, eating at his desk, driving himself and his staff with an intensity that surprised people who had dismissed him as a career bureaucrat. What distinguished Eisenhower in those early months was not just his capacity for work, but his capacity for clarity. Military planning at the highest level generates enormous amounts of competing information, conflicting priorities, and institutional noise. Eisenhower had an almost surgical ability to cut through that noise and identify what actually mattered. He understood logistics at a level that most combat generals did not bother to develop, and he understood politics, the politics of alliance, of coalition, of managing powerful men with competing agendas, in ways that would prove essential. Marshall watched him navigate these pressures with something approaching satisfaction. He had seen brilliance before, and he had seen discipline before. In Eisenhower, he was watching them work together. Promotion came with a velocity that would have seemed impossible the year before. Within months of arriving in Washington, Eisenhower moved through the ranks in a way that reflected both his own ability and the desperate urgency of the moment. The army that had been slow to reward him during peacetime had no such patience now. By the middle of 1942, Eisenhower was a major general, then a lieutenant general, accumulating responsibility at a rate that compressed decades of peacetime seniority into a matter of weeks. Officers who had outranked him for years found themselves working under his direction. Some resented it. Most, once they worked alongside him, came to understand why Marshall had made the choices he had made. The question of who would command American forces in Europe was itself a study in wartime politics. Britain and America were now formal allies, and the relationship between them was complex. Mutual respect layered over genuine tension. Shared purpose crossed with competing national interests. Churchill and Roosevelt had agreed that Germany represented the primary threat, and that the weight of American military power should be directed first toward the defeat of Nazi Germany. This meant that whoever commanded American forces in Europe would need to do more than lead soldiers. He would need to manage statesmen, generals, intelligence services, supply chains, and the fragile chemistry of an alliance that could, if handled badly, fracture at the worst possible moment. Marshall recognized, though it cost him personally to do so, that Eisenhower was better suited to that specific combination of demands than almost any other officer in the army. In June of 1942, Eisenhower was sent to London as commanding general of the European Theater of Operations. It was, on paper, an administrative appointment. In practice, it was a signal from Marshall and from Roosevelt that Eisenhower was the man through whom American power in Europe would be channeled and organized. He arrived in London, to a city scarred by the Blitz, a city that had endured something Americans were only beginning to understand: the relentless, grinding reality of total war against a determined industrial enemy. The British greeted their new American counterpart with courtesy and, in some cases, poorly concealed skepticism. Eisenhower had not commanded troops in combat. He had never led men into battle. The campaigns ahead would determine whether the staff officer from Kansas could become something more. By the autumn of 1942, Eisenhower's rapid ascension had carried him further and faster than even the most ambitious projections of his earlier career could have suggested. He was not yet 52 years old. He had never fired a weapon in anger. He had spent most of his professional life in postings that offered no glory and generated no headlines. And yet, by the measure of the moment, by the specific combination of qualities that the war demanded, he was exactly the right man in exactly the right place. The machinery of American power, its industry, its manpower, its enormous logistical capacity, was turning over, building momentum, preparing to carry the weight of a civilizational contest. Eisenhower stood at the junction where that machinery met the messy human reality of coalition warfare. He understood both worlds. He was prepared, in ways even he may not have fully recognized, for what was coming. Pearl Harbor had done something to the country and something to the man. For America, the attack had ended a debate and ignited a unity of purpose that its enemies had catastrophically miscalculated. For Eisenhower, it had ended a different kind of waiting, the long, patient, sometimes agonizing wait of a talented officer consigned to the margins of a peacetime institution. He had spent nearly 3 decades preparing for a war that had finally arrived. The years in the Philippines, the years in the desert, the years of unglamorous staff work that had seemed, at the time, like punishment. They had all been building something, and now, with a world at war and everything that mattered balanced on the edge of decisions not yet made, Dwight Eisenhower was exactly where history needed him to be. He had never commanded men in battle, not once. Through nearly 3 decades of service, through the grinding tedium of peacetime garrisons, through the bureaucratic corridors of Washington, through the sun-baked dust of the Philippines, Dwight Eisenhower had watched other men lead soldiers into fire, while he sat at desks, drew up plans, and moved units across paper maps. Now, in the autumn of 1942, the most powerful military alliance in modern history was handing him an army and pointing it toward the shores of North Africa. The pressure was staggering, the doubts were real, and the man himself knew, perhaps better than anyone, exactly how much he did not yet know about combat command. What he was about to learn would cost him dearly, and make him something altogether harder. The operation was called Torch, and its ambition was breathtaking. The plan called for simultaneous landings across more than 1,000 kilometers of coastline, at Casablanca on the Atlantic coast of Morocco, at Oran, and at Algiers along the Mediterranean shore of Algeria. 3 task forces, drawn from American and British forces, would strike at night and secure French North Africa before German or Italian reinforcements could respond. The idea was elegant in conception, ferociously complicated in execution. French colonial forces, loyal to the Vichy government that had collaborated with Nazi Germany, garrisoned these territories, and nobody could say with confidence whether they would fight or stand aside. Eisenhower spent weeks attempting to navigate the politics before a single soldier had waded ashore. It was a preview of everything that was to come. The French question was the first great education. Eisenhower's planners had hoped that certain French commanders could be persuaded to welcome the Allies rather than resist them. Secret negotiations unfolded in the shadows, with American agents slipping in and out of North Africa to broker back-channel arrangements. The calculus was brutally cynical by necessity. The Allies needed French compliance more than they needed French enthusiasm, and that meant dealing with men whose political records were, to put it generously, complicated. Eisenhower, a man of straightforward Midwestern instincts, found himself operating in a world of moving loyalties and old grievances he had never been trained to navigate. The French Colonial Officer Corps nursed wounds from the fall of France in 1940, from the British attack on the French fleet at Mers el-Kebir, from years of national humiliation. These were not wounds that American goodwill could easily heal. The landings themselves began in the early hours of the 8th of November, 1942, and for Eisenhower, the experience of watching from his command post in Gibraltar was uniquely agonizing. He was close enough to hear reports as they trickled in, far enough removed to change nothing once the first wave hit the beaches. At Algiers, the resistance was relatively brief. At Oran, it was sharper. At Casablanca, American forces faced determined French opposition for several days, and the fighting was genuine. Men died on both sides, killing one another under flags that were not supposed to be enemies. Eisenhower absorbed those casualties the way a new kind of man learns a new kind of mathematics, not in columns of figures, but in weight. Each report of losses carried a specific gravity he had never felt before, moving pieces on a map. French resistance collapsed within 3 days, largely due to political negotiations running in parallel to the fighting. An armistice was arranged, and French North Africa passed into Allied hands, but at a political price that immediately drew fire. To secure a quick ceasefire, Eisenhower and his political superiors struck a deal with Admiral François Darlan, a senior Vichy official who happened to be present in Algiers when the landings began. Darlan was, by any honest accounting, a collaborator. He had served the Vichy regime with conviction, and now he was being handed authority over French North Africa in exchange for his cooperation. The outcry on both sides of the Atlantic was furious. Press editorials accused Eisenhower of making a pact with fascism. Free French forces under General Charles de Gaulle were incensed. Eisenhower, who had made a cold military calculation to save lives and speed the campaign, found himself at the center of a political firestorm he had not anticipated. He did not waver in public, but privately the criticism cut deep. He had acted, he believed, on sound military logic. Secure the territory first, sort out the politics after. That logic was not wrong, but it revealed something he had not yet fully absorbed, that at the level of command he now occupied, military decisions and political consequences were not separate categories. Every operational choice sent ripples far beyond the battlefield, into parliaments and newspaper offices, and the offices of allied governments. General Marshall, back in Washington, supported him. President Franklin Roosevelt provided cover, but Eisenhower emerged from the Darlan affair older, more alert to the world of consequences that lived on the other side of every order he signed. And then there was the desert, moving his forces east toward Tunisia, where German and Italian troops held strong positions under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's successor commands. Eisenhower confronted the brutal reality of fighting in terrain he had never studied from horseback or training ground. American troops, green and untested, ran headlong into veterans of years of desert warfare. In mid-February of 1943, at a place called Kasserine Pass in the mountains of western Tunisia, German armored forces drove through American positions in a rout that shocked the Allied command. American units broke. Equipment was abandoned. Men died in confused, disorganized retreats. The engagement was not decisive in the grand strategic sense, but it was devastating to American confidence and to Eisenhower's reputation. Kasserine was the hardest lesson the campaign had to teach. Critics, both Allied and American, pointed fingers at Eisenhower's command arrangements, at the confused chain of authority, at the poor coordination between Allied national contingents. The British, particularly General Harold Alexander, who commanded ground forces under Eisenhower, looked at their American counterparts with barely concealed contempt. Some of it was fair. Some of it was the habitual condescension of men who had been fighting since 1939 toward a nation that had arrived late to the war. Eisenhower absorbed all of it. He had, in those weeks after Kasserine, to make a choice about the kind of commander he intended to be, someone who defended himself or someone who fixed the problem. He chose to fix. The reorganization of American forces in North Africa following Kasserine was swift and, in retrospect, essential. Eisenhower made hard decisions about personnel. General Lloyd Fredendall, whose command had performed worst in the crisis, was relieved. In his place came George S. Patton, a man volcanic in temperament, brilliant in armored warfare, and utterly unlike Eisenhower in every dimension of personality. Eisenhower knew Patton's gifts and Patton's dangers with equal clarity. He gave Patton the command he needed and watched as American forces were beaten back into fighting shape with a ferocity that was, even by the standards of war, remarkable to observe. The relationship between Eisenhower and Patton, complicated, respectful, frequently exasperated on both sides, was becoming one of the defining instruments of the Allied war effort. Coalition warfare, Eisenhower was discovering, was not a concept. It was a daily grind of competing egos, national sensitivities, and institutional jealousies that had to be managed with the same relentlessness as any military operation. The British and American staffs clashed over strategy, over resources, over credit. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commanding British Eighth Army from the east as it drove Rommel's forces westward, was already emerging as the kind of personality that could drive subordinates and superiors to the edge of madness, brilliant, imperious, and constitutionally incapable of acknowledging that anyone else might know something he did not. Eisenhower was developing, of necessity, a fluency in human management that no staff college had ever taught. He learned to absorb insults without reacting, to praise British officers in terms that cost him nothing and bought him cooperation, to hold his own anger in reserve for moments when it might actually accomplish something. By May of 1943, the campaign was over. German and Italian forces in North Africa surrendered in numbers that staggered even the optimists. More than 200,000 prisoners taken as the Tunisian bridgehead collapsed. It was the largest Axis surrender of the war to that point, and it opened the Mediterranean to Allied shipping for the first time since 1940. Operation Torch had achieved what it set out to achieve. North Africa was gone from the Axis map. The way to southern Europe was open, and Dwight Eisenhower, the man who had never heard a shot fired in anger at the start of it all, had brought his first campaign to a successful conclusion. But he knew what the campaign had cost, in errors, in lives, in painful improvisations. He knew what Kasserine had revealed and what the Darlan affair had taught him about the world he now inhabited. He emerged from North Africa not triumphant in the chest-thumping sense, but educated, genuinely, deeply educated in the craft of commanding coalition armies on a continental scale. The messy, frustrating, politically treacherous education of Operation Torch was, in fact, exactly the preparation he needed. Sicily lay ahead. France lay beyond that. And with each lesson came the quiet, accumulated confidence of a man who had looked at his own limitations honestly and begun the long work of overcoming them. The success of Operation Torch in North Africa had transformed Eisenhower's standing within the military hierarchy, but it had also exposed the brittleness of Allied coordination. The campaign had been costly, inefficient, and marked by friction between commanders who had never fought together before. Yet it had proven something essential, that American and British forces, however different their doctrines and temperaments, could operate under a single command structure and achieve their objectives. As 1943 dawned, the strategic question consuming the Allied leadership was no longer whether they could fight together, but whether they possessed the audacity to attempt something far more ambitious. The eyes of London and Washington turned toward Sicily, a stepping stone that would test not merely Eisenhower's abilities as a commander, but the viability of the entire European strategy that hung in the balance. Sicily held symbolic weight disproportionate to its size. The island sat at the crossroads of the Mediterranean, a gateway to Italy and ultimately to the European continent itself. To the Soviets, demanding a second front to relieve pressure on their own suffering armies. Sicily represented a thin consolation prize, not the cross-channel assault on France they desperately wanted, but evidence that the Western Allies were taking offensive action. To the Americans, the island offered a testing ground for amphibious warfare on a scale never before attempted. To Eisenhower, it represented something more personal, a chance to prove that the lessons of North Africa had been absorbed, that coordination among his fractious subordinates had genuinely improved, and that large-scale combined operations were not merely theoretical exercises, but achievable military objectives. The weight of this moment settled upon him as he moved his headquarters to North Africa to oversee the preparation. Eisenhower faced the familiar challenge of managing powerful men with competing visions. General Alexander, the British ground commander, had his preferences. General Patton, the American commander of 7th Army, had his own aggressive instincts and deep conviction that he understood mobile warfare better than anyone in theater. General Montgomery, commanding 8th Army from across the straits in North Africa, regarded himself as the finest tactical mind in the Mediterranean and was not shy in voicing disagreement with plans he deemed insufficiently cautious. General Bernard Freyberg of New Zealand and other commanders of smaller contingents each carried their own concerns and expectations. Eisenhower's task was not to choose which general was right. Each brought genuine insight, but to forge these competing perspectives into a coherent strategy. This was the unglamorous work of supreme command, the orchestration of egos and intellects that separated successful campaigns from those that collapsed under their own internal contradictions. The operational plan that emerged reflected months of argument, revision, and pragmatic compromise. The invasion would strike Sicily's southern coast on the night of the 9th of July, 1943, with American forces under Patton landing on the western beaches and British forces under Montgomery striking farther east. The airborne elements would drop inland to secure crucial inland positions and disrupt enemy reinforcement. The logistical undertaking was staggering. More than 160,000 troops would hit the beaches in the first phase, supported by naval bombardment and air cover on a scale that had never been assembled for a single operation. Supply ships waited in North African ports, loaded with ammunition, fuel, and food for weeks of sustained combat. The timetable was tight, the weather unpredictable, and success depended on 1,000 details aligning precisely. Eisenhower knew that if the operation failed, the setback would echo through all future planning. If it succeeded, it would prove to skeptics and Soviets alike that the Allies possessed the capacity to mount invasions on the European scale. On the evening of the 8th of July, as the invasion fleet moved toward Sicily's coast, Eisenhower experienced the peculiar agony that would define his greatest commands. The decision was made, the forces committed, and now nothing could be altered except by shifting already launched units. He spent the hours before the assault reading, trying to distract himself from the knowledge that men were moving toward combat under orders he had signed. He thought of the soldiers crammed into landing craft, seasick and apprehensive as they cut through the Mediterranean darkness. He thought of the wives and mothers waiting in America for word that their men had survived. He understood that some would not. The responsibility pressed upon him with physical weight. This was not the abstract authority of the staff officer in Washington or the shadowy planning that had characterized his earlier roles. This was direct command over the lives of hundreds of thousands, the ability to alter the fates of continents with a single decision, and the burden could not be delegated. The invasion itself demonstrated both the progress Eisenhower's command structure had achieved and the chaos that still attended even the most carefully prepared operations. The airborne drops went largely awry, with transport planes blown off course by winds and scattered over miles of Sicilian terrain. Many paratroopers landed in locations bearing little resemblance to their intended drop zones, yet this disorder, in a peculiar way, benefited the invasion. The scattered airborne troops created confusion among the Italian defenders about where the main assault was coming. By the time clarity emerged, the amphibious landings were already establishing themselves ashore. The naval gunfire support proved devastatingly effective, and American and British troops pushed inland from their respective beaches with growing momentum. Within 24 hours, it became clear that the invasion would succeed, that the Italians would not mount a serious counteroffensive, and that Sicily would fall into Allied hands. But success, Eisenhower was learning, bred its own complications. Patton, given the western beaches, saw opportunity spreading before him like an unclaimed empire. The American general possessed extraordinary mobility and an instinctive understanding of how to exploit success through rapid movement. He wanted to drive his armored forces across the island in a daring sweep that would encircle enemy forces and win the campaign through speed and audacity. Montgomery, commanding on the eastern flank, favored a more methodical approach, concentrating forces for a powerful thrust up the eastern coast toward Messina, the strategic objective that would cut off enemy escape routes. The two commanders viewed each other with a mixture of respect and profound skepticism. Eisenhower had to manage their ambitions without crushing either's initiative, a delicate calibration that consumed enormous quantities of his mental energy. He allowed Patton considerable latitude, recognizing that American aggressiveness might in fact prove decisive, while also ensuring that Montgomery's more careful approach did not bog down into endless consolidation. The campaign that unfolded over 38 days revealed the growing sophistication of American military operations, while also exposing how far they remained from genuine mastery. Patton's westward drive achieved stunning speed, his forces covering vast distances and fighting sharp engagements with Italian and German defenders. Yet the plan to encircle the enemy forces ultimately failed, as German units executed a skilled fighting withdrawal and escaped across the straits to mainland Italy. Patton's drive toward Palermo, Sicily's capital, succeeded spectacularly from a symbolic perspective, but added little to the campaign's strategic conclusion. When American forces finally raced toward Messina in the final days, they found that German forces had already evacuated across the narrow strait to Calabria. The Allies had conquered Sicily, but they had not trapped or destroyed the defending forces in the comprehensive way that would have constituted true victory. Eisenhower understood this limitation even as he acknowledged the operation's overall success. The invasion had demonstrated capability, but it had also revealed the gap between competent execution and flawless strategy. Yet, in the broader context of the war, Sicily represented something far more significant than the details of campaign management or the failure to destroy defending forces. It proved that large-scale amphibious invasion was operationally feasible. It demonstrated that American forces could conduct complex combined operations involving air, naval, and ground elements in coordination. It showed that Eisenhower's command structure, despite its inherent frictions, could function effectively under extreme stress. For the staffs in London and Washington who were already sketching the outlines of the assault on Normandy, Sicily provided empirical evidence that what they were planning was not an impossible fantasy, but a difficult objective that skilled commanders could achieve. The size of the Normandy operation would be vastly larger, the opposition more formidable, and the consequences of failure almost unimaginable. But Sicily had removed the categorical objection that such an invasion lay beyond human capability. The campaign's conclusion, marked by the raising of Allied flags over Messina on the 17th of July, prompted celebrations across America and Britain. Eisenhower, standing before cameras and newspapermen, spoke of the men who had fought on the beaches and in the Sicilian interior, who had sweltered in the Mediterranean heat and suffered the ordinary miseries of combat. He acknowledged the courage of British forces and American forces alike. He spoke carefully about the role that the Italian people themselves would play in the liberation of their own nation, knowing that the next phase would involve crossing into mainland Italy and beginning the long campaign that would define the next 2 years. Behind his measured public statements lay a keen awareness that Sicily had solved one problem while raising another. The invasion had been successful, but it had also demonstrated that Italian resistance was crumbling. Within weeks of the Sicilian campaign's conclusion, the Mussolini regime would fall, and the question of whether Italy would surrender or continue fighting would define Eisenhower's next challenge. Eisenhower's role in Sicily, though less personally dramatic than Patton's races across the island or Montgomery's methodical set-piece battles, was in many ways more consequential. As Supreme Commander, he had orchestrated the operation from a position of overall authority, resisting the temptation to interfere in tactical details while maintaining strategic oversight. He had managed the ambitions of powerful subordinates without allowing bureaucratic caution to dampen their aggressive instincts. He had absorbed criticism, made difficult compromises, and sustained his authority through the long campaign, despite pressure from multiple directions. These skills, more than any single tactical insight, would define his value to the larger war effort. The generals who reported to him recognized, grudgingly, that he possessed something they did not: the ability to see the entire board and make decisions that benefited the whole rather than any individual component. The summer of 1943 marked a turning point in Eisenhower's understanding of what his command could accomplish. Sicily had begun as a debate about whether the operation was even possible. It concluded with strategists already planning something far more ambitious: the cross-channel assault on France, which had seemed almost theoretical in its difficulty, now appeared not merely possible, but necessary and achievable. Eisenhower's authority was no longer that of a competent administrator chosen to manage difficult personalities. He had become, in the eyes of the Allied leadership, a commander who could take enormous risks and deliver success. The weight of this confidence settled upon him as he turned his attention toward the next phase of the war. He understood that Sicily had been a testing ground, and that he had passed the examination. What awaited was something far greater: the invasion of the fortress continent itself. In the closing months of 1943, the machinery of war had reached a critical juncture. The Allies had seized the initiative in North Africa, crossed into Sicily, and begun their slow, grinding ascent up the Italian peninsula. Yet for all these gains, the true measure of victory remained uncertain. Germany still controlled most of continental Europe. Hitler's armies dug deeper into fortified positions. The question that haunted every war room from Washington to London was no longer whether the Allies could win, but whether they could afford to wait. Somewhere in the gray winter darkness of December, a decision was made that would alter the course of human history. Dwight David Eisenhower, the quiet officer from Kansas who had risen from obscurity through competence and circumstance, was about to assume the most consequential military appointment of the 20th century. He would be named Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force in Europe. The entire liberation of Western Europe would rest in his hands. Eisenhower's selection was not the result of accident. General George Marshall, the architect of American military strategy, understood that the war required not merely a brilliant tactician, but a man capable of managing the egos and interests of an unprecedented alliance. The British, jealous of their centuries of military tradition, needed to feel respected. The Americans, ascendant in industrial power but uncertain in military experience, required steady leadership. The Free French, humiliated by their earlier defeat, hungered for vindication. Eisenhower had demonstrated in North Africa and Sicily that he possessed a rare gift: the ability to disagree with other commanders without creating lasting bitterness. He listened, he reasoned, he compromised without surrendering his judgment. Marshall recognized that these qualities mattered more than raw tactical genius. On the 7th of December, 1943, exactly 2 years after Pearl Harbor, the announcement was made official. Eisenhower would leave the Mediterranean theater and assume his new post in London, where the greatest invasion in history was being planned in meticulous, obsessive detail. The transition itself was a study in the machinery of military command. Eisenhower traveled from Algiers to London in a journey that itself carried symbolic weight. He was leaving behind the region where he had first tested himself in large-scale warfare. He was moving toward his true destiny. The crossing by ship and aircraft gave him time to reflect. He knew that the job awaiting him would demand everything he possessed. In London, He found a city already transformed by years of war and the careful preparations for what everyone knew was coming, the invasion. Not a possibility, but an inevitability. Every resource, every plan, every conversation in the corridors of power revolved around one question: how and when would the Allies return to France? The invasion itself had been under planning for months before Eisenhower's arrival. British and American staff officers had been quietly building the infrastructure of amphibious assault. They had calculated requirements for landing craft, assembled detailed maps of the Normandy coast, and begun the process of gathering the human instruments of war: soldiers, sailors, engineers, and the thousands upon thousands of support personnel required to sustain an invasion across the English Channel. Yet all of these preparations had lacked something crucial: a supreme commander with the authority to pull together the fractious elements of the alliance and the courage to make the final decision. That was Eisenhower's charge. He arrived in London to assume an office in a corner of a building on Grosvenor Square, from which he would orchestrate the largest amphibious operation in history. The weight of the position was not lost on him. He understood, with a clarity that sometimes troubled his sleep, that the men under his command were his responsibility. Their lives were not abstract numbers on a strategic document. They were individuals, farmers and factory workers, teachers and accountants, torn from their homes and sent across an ocean to an uncertain fate. What Eisenhower inherited was a collection of brilliant, powerful, and sometimes conflicting personalities. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery commanded the 21st Army Group and brought with him both exceptional military skill and an ego of considerable dimensions. Air Chief Marshal Arthur Tedder represented the Royal Air Force and fought constantly with Montgomery over the proper role of air power in the invasion. General Omar Bradley, commanding the 1st United States Army, was a careful and methodical officer who would prove to be one of Eisenhower's most reliable and valued subordinates. Then there were the British commanders, seasoned professionals who had fought Germany for 4 years and possessed both wisdom and a certain weariness. Eisenhower's role was to harness all of this talent, manage the inevitable conflicts of interest, and forge a unity of purpose that was fragile at best. He did this not through the assertion of raw authority, but through his ability to listen, to understand the legitimate concerns of each commander, and to find the common ground upon which all could stand. He held daily meetings, he traveled constantly, he visited units to speak with officers and soldiers. He built relationships that transcended rank and nationality. The planning process itself was staggering in its complexity. The invasion would require more than 200,000 men to land on the beaches of Normandy on the first day alone. Hundreds of thousands more would follow in the succeeding days and weeks. The logistical requirements were unprecedented. How many landing craft would be needed? How much ammunition? How many trucks? How many replacement soldiers? Every calculation had to account for contingencies and failures. What if weather prevented the invasion? What if German air power proved stronger than intelligence suggested? What if the German army counterattacked more fiercely than anticipated? Eisenhower would sit in planning meetings, listening to the endless calculations and arguments, offering his judgment when clarity was needed. He had the practical mind of an engineer, combined with the strategic understanding of a general who had learned his trade through years of unglamorous staff work. He understood that wars were not won through brilliant maneuvers alone. They were won through the management of resources, the coordination of effort, and the ability to sustain an operation under conditions of uncertainty and partial information. One of the most crucial decisions Eisenhower had to make involved the timing and location of the invasion. Should the Allies attempt to land in Normandy, a region further west but with more favorable geography for breakout operations, or should they attempt a landing further east, closer to German industrial centers but more heavily defended? The planners brought him their arguments. Eisenhower listened and ultimately endorsed the choice of Normandy. It was a decision that would prove sound, though no one could know with certainty at the time. The invasion would also require extraordinary coordination between the American, British, and Canadian forces. that would bear the brunt of the initial assault. Eisenhower understood that national pride could not be allowed to interfere with military necessity. He assigned areas of responsibility based on strategic logic and available resources. When commanders protested, he explained his reasoning and expected them to execute his orders with professional dedication. His authority rested not on the threat of court-martial or the assertion of raw power, but on the confidence that his subordinates had in his judgment and fairness. The question of air power proved to be one of the most contentious issues Eisenhower had to navigate. The air commanders wanted to focus exclusively on strategic bombing, raids deep into Germany designed to destroy the enemy's capacity to wage war. Eisenhower believed, rightly, that air power would need to support the invasion more directly. In the weeks before the invasion, Allied aircraft would need to destroy enemy air bases, bridges, and supply lines in Normandy and the surrounding region. This meant a temporary shift in air strategy. The air commanders objected. They believed that focusing on tactical air support would reduce their ability to prosecute their own campaign. Eisenhower held firm. He understood that without air superiority over the invasion beaches, the entire operation could fail. In the end, he prevailed. The air commanders accepted his logic, though not without some lingering resentment. This pattern would repeat itself throughout Eisenhower's time as Supreme Commander. He would encounter resistance, listen to the arguments, make his decision, and expect compliance. Most of the time, his judgment would prove sound. Eisenhower was also acutely conscious of the political dimensions of his role. The war was not merely a military contest. It was a struggle between different visions of Europe's future. The Soviet Union, America's ally against Germany, harbored its own ambitions for Eastern Europe. The British were concerned about their imperial interests. The Americans wanted to defeat Germany and return home. France wanted to reclaim its position as a major power. Eisenhower could not control these larger political currents, but he understood them. He knew that the invasion would have political consequences that extended far beyond the immediate military objective. He tried, with limited success, to shape those consequences in ways that would benefit the post-war world. He advocated for a united approach to Germany after the invasion, believing that harsh vindictiveness would only breed future conflict. He understood that the Soviets would play a crucial role in defeating Germany, and that managing that relationship would be essential to achieving a durable peace. In the months following his appointment, Eisenhower threw himself into the work with total commitment. He had spent 20 years waiting for his moment, watching others win glory while he organized supply lines and oversaw administrative details. Now, at last, he had been given a command worthy of his talents. The weight of responsibility might have crushed a lesser man. Eisenhower carried it with the quiet strength that had become his trademark. He understood that the men under his command, hundreds of thousands of them, would soon face death or wounds or the lasting psychological scars of combat. He understood that his decisions would determine whether some of them would live and others would not. This knowledge never left him. It manifested in the care with which he made every decision, the patience with which he listened to advisors, and the clarity of his thinking in the face of uncertainty. By early 1944, everything was in place. The invasion fleet was being assembled. The troops were training relentlessly. The detailed plans for the assault were being refined and revised constantly as new intelligence arrived. Eisenhower had established his headquarters and surrounded himself with a staff of exceptional officers who understood the scope of the challenge before them. The Supreme Commander had done what he was appointed to do. He had brought unity to a fractious alliance, created a coherent plan for the greatest military operation in history, and prepared the human and material resources that would soon be called upon to execute that plan. Now, there was nothing to do but wait. In the winter darkness of early 1944, the invasion fleet remained hidden in English ports. The troops remained in their camps, training and preparing. Eisenhower remained in his headquarters, going over plans and calculations, knowing that in the coming months, his authority would be tested as never before. He had been chosen for this moment, because of his ability to manage complexity and lead men through uncertainty. Soon, the entire world would know whether that confidence had been justified. The morning of the 6th of June 1944 began in darkness. Eisenhower had not slept. He moved between the operations tent and the weather office at Southwick House on the Hampshire coast, a man suspended between two worlds, the world that had been and the world that would come after the next few hours. Outside, the channel churned. The forecast had been grim for days. Clouds hung low over the water. Wind pushed against the temporary structures that housed more than 5,000 men preparing to coordinate the largest amphibious invasion in human history. Eisenhower stood in the weather briefing room, his face drawn, his eyes fixed on the meteorologists as they explained the thin window that had opened in the storm system. A delay of even one day would push the operation back 14 days. The tidal conditions would not align again. A 14-day delay meant security compromised, morale eroded, the enemy given time to reinforce. But launching into uncertain weather meant launching blind, with the possibility of catastrophic loss before the first soldiers even touched French soil. Eisenhower understood that he alone would make this decision. He was the supreme commander. The responsibility was his alone. By dawn, over 5,000 ships and landing craft crowded the waters off the English coast. Nearly 2 million men were either already at sea or standing by to embark. In the holds and on the decks, soldiers checked their weapons, wrote letters home, prayed, and fell into that peculiar silence that comes before violence. The invasion had a code name, Operation Overlord, but to the men who were living through it, it had no name at all. It was simply the moment toward which every day of training, every hour of preparation had been driving them. Some were 19 years old, some had wives waiting, some knew, with the clarity that comes only in the moments before mortal danger, that they would not see home again. The air forces were already in motion. Over 11,000 aircraft were either in the sky or waiting on airfields across southern England, their pilots running through pre-flight checks, their bomb bays loaded, their radio frequencies locked. The bombardment would begin at dawn. There was no turning back now. The ships were moving. The planes were launching. The machine that Eisenhower had helped build was in motion, and he could no longer do anything but watch it unfold. In the hours before the invasion, Eisenhower moved among the men who would execute his orders. He visited airfields where paratroopers were boarding transports, men of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions who would jump into darkness behind enemy lines and secure the flanks of the beach landings. He spoke to them with genuine warmth, asking their names, learning where they came from, touching their shoulders. A photograph was taken of him with paratroopers in full combat gear, their faces shadowed with olive drab, their eyes serious. In that image, Eisenhower appears almost serene, steady, confident, a man at peace with the weight he was carrying. But those who were with him that morning remember his hands shaking slightly. His jaw was tight. The weight of command was visible in the set of his shoulders, in the careful control with which he moved. He knew what amphibious landings cost. He had seen it at Torch, tasted it at Sicily, understood it intellectually from the planning sessions and the casualty projections. But today, the projections would become flesh. The estimates of 5,000 casualties, or was it 10,000, would become names. They would become mothers' sons. They would become the reason why some men who boarded ships that morning would not board ships again. The decision to launch had been made during the night. The meteorologists predicted a brief window of improved conditions early on the 6th of June. It was not ideal. It was far from ideal, but it was the best that could be offered. Eisenhower had consulted with his principal commanders, Montgomery, who would oversee the invasion itself, Lee Mallory, commander of the air forces, and the others whose reputations and lives depended on this choice. The consensus was clear. The window existed, it was narrow, and it would not come again for 2 weeks. To delay was to risk everything that had been built. To launch was to risk everything that would be built. Eisenhower made the decision at 04:15 in the morning. Later, he would draft an alternative message, to be released in case the invasion failed catastrophically. In it, he accepted full responsibility. He did not blame the weather, he did not blame his commanders. He wrote that the fault was his own, that he had made the decision and that if it had failed, the burden rested entirely on his shoulders. That message was never released. But the fact that Eisenhower drafted it at all in the dark hours before the invasion speaks to the clarity with which he understood the stakes. By 06:30 in the morning, the naval bombardment of the French coast had begun. Shells from battleships and cruisers screamed across the water, and the coast around Normandy erupted in fire and smoke. The sound was immense, a rolling thunder that could be heard miles away, a constant percussion that seemed to crack the very sky open. The men in the landing craft heard it and understood that the invasion was truly beginning. Some prayed, some were sick, some sat in the cold spray in silence, thinking of things they had never thought of before, or perhaps thinking of nothing at all, their minds having shut down in the face of what was coming. The aircraft overhead, thousands of them, began their bombing runs. Through gaps in the clouds, they could see the coast flashing with light. Anti-aircraft fire arced upward. Planes were hit and fell smoking into the channel, but the bombers kept coming, wave after wave, hour after hour. By 07:30, the first assault waves were approaching the beaches. The landing craft bucked in the heavy sea, and men hung over the sides, seasick and terrified. The sound of artillery and aircraft intensified. Ahead, the beaches rose from the water, bluffs and cliffs and sand fortified with obstacles and barbed wire. The Germans had known the invasion was coming. They had not known precisely where or when, but they had prepared. Concrete obstacles bristled from the sand. Machine gun nests had been dug into the bluffs. Minefields had been laid. This was not a beach that would simply yield to the Allied assault. This was a fortified position, and the men in the landing craft were about to launch themselves against it with nothing but rifles and bayonets and the desperate courage that comes from knowing there is nowhere to go but forward. Eisenhower had moved to the command ship by this time, and he waited there in the gray morning, receiving reports. The flow of information was fragmentary and often contradictory. The weather was worse than predicted. The bombardment had not destroyed as many German positions as hoped. The paratroopers, were they in position? How many had made it? Reports suggested that the drops had been scattered, that some units had landed miles from their intended zones, but they were on the ground, they were fighting. Radio reports came in from the beach commanders. The first waves had gone ashore. There were casualties, heavy casualties on some beaches. Omaha Beach, where the American 1st Division was landing, was particularly bad. The intelligence that had suggested the German defenses there were lighter than they actually were proved wrong. Young men who had trained for months, who had rehearsed the movements and the tactics, who had written letters and said goodbye to their mothers, were dying in the sand before they had even made it off the beach. By mid-morning, it became clear that, despite the difficulties, the invasion was succeeding. More waves were landing. The beach commanders were establishing control. The chaos that had threatened to undo the entire operation in the first hours was beginning to resolve into something resembling order. Units that had been scattered were finding each other. Dead were being left behind for the moment, and the living were pushing inland, away from the murderous fire of the beaches. The paratroopers, although scattered, were causing chaos behind German lines, cutting telephone wires, ambushing German reinforcements, making themselves present and terrible in the darkness. By noon, Eisenhower knew that he had not failed. The beaches had held, the men had fought, the invasion had taken root on the shore of France. But the knowledge that Overlord would not fail did not erase what had happened that morning. Thousands were dead. Thousands more were wounded, lying in temporary aid stations, being loaded onto hospital ships, waiting for surgery or bleeding out in the sand, because there was nothing that could be done for them. The price of the invasion, the true price, not the estimated price, but the actual, irreplaceable, permanent price, was being totaled up in the sand and smoke of Normandy. Eisenhower understood this. He had known it was coming. He had calculated it. But knowing and witnessing are different things. By the evening of the 6th of June, intelligence reports were being compiled. Casualty figures were being gathered. The numbers were grim. They were also less than some of the worst predictions had suggested. The operation had succeeded. The price had been terrible, but it could have been worse. It was the knowledge of that gap between what had happened and what might have happened that would stay with Eisenhower for the rest of his life. The decision to launch Operation Overlord had been Eisenhower's alone, but the weight of it was distributed across the shoulders of every man who had stood on a beach or jumped into darkness or flown over Normandy that day. What Eisenhower carried away from the morning of the 6th of June was not the satisfaction of victory or the relief of success, but something deeper and more troubling. The knowledge that leadership sometimes means making decisions that result in the death of young men, that success and tragedy are not opposites, but rather two sides of the same event. 1,000 ships had crossed the Channel. 100,000 men had come ashore on the first day. They had achieved what military theorists had said was impossible. They had established a foothold on a heavily defended coast and begun the process of liberating Europe. But the cost was written in names and faces and letters that would arrive home unopened. Eisenhower knew this. He carried it. In the weeks and months that followed, as the breakout from Normandy began and the great sweep across France commenced, Eisenhower moved forward as he always did, focused on the next objective, the next challenge. But the weight of the 6th of June remained. It would remain for the rest of his life, a permanent part of the man who had become the supreme commander and who had sent 250,000 men to war on a gray morning in June, knowing that some of them would not come home. By the end of the first day, it was clear that the beachhead would hold. The Germans had launched counterattacks, but they lacked the coordination and the resources to push the Allies back into the sea. The weather had improved. The supply lines were being established. The steady flow of men and materiel that had been planned and rehearsed for months was beginning to move across the Channel. Eisenhower had proven himself capable of managing the most complex military operation yet attempted. He had coordinated air forces and naval forces and ground forces, each operating under separate commanders, each with their own agenda and their own understanding of how the invasion should proceed. He had held it together. He had made the crucial decision in the dark hours before dawn. He had accepted responsibility, and he had prevailed. What awaited him now was not the end of the war, but the beginning of the next phase, the consolidation of the beachhead, the breakout from Normandy, the long, hard grind across France and into Germany itself. But that is the story of the months that followed. The story of the 6th of June is the story of a man confronting the full weight of command, standing in the rain on the shore of southern England, watching ships move toward an uncertain horizon, accepting that the decisions he made would echo in the lives of a generation. It is the story of a moment when Dwight Eisenhower became not simply a general, but the general, the man upon whose shoulders rested the fate of nations. The invasion was only the beginning. On the beaches of Normandy, Eisenhower had staked everything: his reputation, the lives of hundreds of thousands, the entire future of the Allied cause. The landings had succeeded, but success on the sand was not victory in Europe. Behind the Atlantic wall lay the bocage, the dense Norman hedgerow country that would become a maze of blood and patience. Eisenhower knew this terrain would be different from anything his commanders had trained for. The open breakthrough they had imagined in war rooms would not come quickly. Instead, the American and British forces found themselves locked in a grinding, desperate fight for every field, every village, every kilometer of mud and fire. The hedgerows themselves became fortifications, each one a potential German strongpoint, each one requiring men to die to advance a few hundred yards. By the end of June, 6 weeks after the landings, the Allies were still struggling to break out of the beachhead, and the casualty lists were already shocking. Eisenhower faced a command structure fractured by ego and national pride. General Omar Bradley commanded the American First Army, a capable officer who earned Eisenhower's deep trust. General Bernard Law Montgomery, commanding British and Canadian forces under the broader Allied umbrella, was brilliant but arrogant, convinced that the British way of war was superior to all others. The two men clashed constantly over strategy, timing, and resources. Montgomery wanted a slow, methodical advance with overwhelming force at each point. Bradley and the Americans pushed for speed and encirclement, worried that a grinding attrition would play into German strengths. Eisenhower stood between them, trying to preserve both the military logic of each plan and the fragile coalition itself. One wrong word, one obvious slight to either commander, and the entire structure could splinter. He had learned from North Africa and Sicily that keeping the alliance intact was as much a weapon as tanks or artillery. His role became less about giving brilliant tactical orders and more about hearing brilliant officers, weighing their contradictions, and forging consensus from disagreement. The breakout from Normandy came slowly and at terrible cost. Through July, the Allies inched forward through the bocage, losing men at rates that shocked even hardened commanders. The British and Canadians became locked around the city of Caen, meant to fall on the first day, but held by German defenders for weeks. The Americans, meanwhile, struggled through the hedgerows towards Saint-Lô, a town that became a symbol of the grinding, meaningless violence of this new phase of war. Eisenhower visited the front lines repeatedly, walking among exhausted soldiers and casualty stations, absorbing the human cost of his decisions. He wrote in his diary about the horror of seeing young men torn apart by machine gun fire in fields where medieval farmers had worked their land for centuries. Yet he never allowed this anguish to paralyze him. He pushed his commanders, sometimes harshly, to find the breakthrough that would transform the war from a battle of attrition into a war of movement. By late July, the Americans finally broke through at Saint-Lô, and the entire German position began to fracture. The breakout had taken 6 weeks longer than planned, and the casualties were far higher than anticipated, but the beachhead was secure and expanding. With momentum building, Eisenhower orchestrated a strategy of encirclement that would trap massive German forces. The plan was audacious. While the Americans turned south and east, and the British held the Germans in place around Caen, the newly arrived Third Army under General George S. Patton would sweep around the German flank and close the pincers. Patton, flamboyant and reckless and utterly devoted to rapid maneuver, was exactly the instrument Eisenhower needed for this phase. The two men had a complex relationship. Eisenhower had been forced to keep Patton in line for various indiscretions, but he also recognized that Patton's aggressive confidence was sometimes precisely what a faltering offensive needed. By August, the German 7th Army was being compressed into a shrinking pocket near Falaise. This should have been the moment of total collapse, but the Germans, despite impossible odds, managed to punch a narrow corridor through the closing Allied lines. Thousands escaped, though thousands more were captured or killed. It was not the complete annihilation Eisenhower had hoped for, but it was a decisive blow. The German army in France was broken. What remained was pursuit. The liberation of Paris came wrapped in symbolism and emotion that Eisenhower understood, but did not entirely control. The city was not primarily of military importance. It could have been bypassed, but its symbolic power was immense. France needed to feel liberated, needed to see its capital freed from 4 years of occupation, and Eisenhower gave the order to liberate it, even knowing that the military push toward Germany would be slightly delayed. On the 25th of August, French forces under General Philippe Leclerc entered Paris, and the city erupted. Eisenhower allowed French commanders to take the lead in the liberation, understanding that this was not about American military efficiency, but about French honor and national restoration. When Eisenhower himself entered Paris days later, he was greeted with rapturous crowds, seen as the liberator of France itself. Yet he was uncomfortable with the adulation. In his mind, the war was far from won, and the celebrations distracted from the brutal campaign still ahead. The Germans had fought desperately for every meter of French territory, and they would fight even more desperately for their own soil. The victory in France was real, but incomplete. Germany remained unconquered, and the worst fighting was still to come. Through September and into October, Eisenhower pushed his armies eastward in a broad advance toward the Rhine. The Germans had no unified defense line. They had no reserves to speak of. They were falling back under pressure from both the west and, increasingly, from Soviet advances in the east. It seemed possible that the war might end before winter. Eisenhower pushed his commanders to maintain momentum, to accept risks, to achieve speed. But supply lines were stretching thin, and logistical realities began to constrain operational possibilities. The Allies were fighting at the end of supply lines that stretched back across France to Normandy. Every division pushed further east required more ammunition, more fuel, more food. The debate that emerged was whether to advance on a broad front or concentrate forces for a narrow, deep thrust toward Berlin. Eisenhower chose the broad front strategy, believing it was the only way to maintain pressure across the entire German position and prevent German concentration of force. This decision would be criticized for decades by those who believed a concentrated drive could have ended the war sooner, but at the time, with multiple commanders demanding resources and German forces still fighting, it represented a reasonable choice made in conditions of radical uncertainty. In September, Eisenhower approved Operation Market Garden, a daring attempt by British forces to jump the Rhine by airborne assault and capture the Dutch city of Arnhem. The operation was bold, almost reckless, proposing to drop airborne troops far behind German lines to seize bridges and open a path into Germany. Montgomery championed it, convinced it could break the stalemate and push toward Berlin before the Germans could reorganize. Eisenhower was skeptical but gave his assent, hoping that audacity might achieve what grinding advance could not. The operation began with initial success but quickly unraveled. German resistance was stronger than intelligence had predicted, and the airborne troops at Arnhem found themselves isolated and unable to hold their objectives. The campaign ended in disappointment and failure, with significant casualties and no strategic gain. It was a bitter moment for Eisenhower, watching a major operation collapse, and it deepened his conviction that there were limits to what boldness alone could achieve. The war would not be won by a brilliant stroke, but by systematic advance, overwhelming force, and time. By November, Eisenhower's armies had reached the Rhine at multiple points, but crossing the river remained a formidable challenge. German forces, though depleted, held the eastern bank, and any attempt to bridge the Rhine would be fiercely contested. Eisenhower settled into a strategy of methodical preparation for the final assault, pushing his logistics officers to stockpile supplies, his engineers to prepare bridging equipment, his commanders to plan the crossing operations in meticulous detail. He visited the Rhine himself, studying the terrain, speaking with division commanders about their plans, absorbing the tactical realities of what would come next. The war was approaching its climax, but Eisenhower knew that Germany would fight on its own soil, with fanaticism born of desperation. The casualties would be severe. The end was in sight, but the path to that end ran through winter and through German resistance that might yet surprise him. Then, on the 16th of December, the Germans launched a massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest, and everything changed. Eisenhower was in France when reports came of a German attack of unexpected scale and ferocity. He initially thought it was a probe, a tactical attack to disrupt Allied operations, but within hours it became clear that this was something far larger. The Germans had assembled a substantial force and had punched through weak American lines in the thick forests and snow. The Ardennes offensive, later called the Battle of the Bulge, was a desperate German gamble to split the Allies and drive toward Antwerp. It was born from German desperation and the belief that a dramatic battlefield victory might force the Allies to negotiate. Eisenhower's first response was characteristic. He did not panic, did not blame his commanders for the surprise, and immediately began orchestrating the counteroffensive. He moved reserves, repositioned forces, and gave clear orders to hold and then contain the German advance. The Germans had achieved initial tactical surprise, but Eisenhower had the strategic reserves and the overall position to turn even a severe setback into a manageable problem. The Ardennes battle raged through Christmas and into January, and it tested Eisenhower in ways that even D-Day had not. The surprise German attack threatened to undo months of grinding advance. The weather was brutal, the terrain treacherous, and American units were scattered and confused by the sudden German assault. Yet Eisenhower's calm was absolute. He issued orders to the effect that his troops would hold their positions, would not retreat further, and would counterattack as soon as reserves could be assembled. He worked closely with his commanders to contain the German breakthrough, first stopping the advance and then gradually compressing it from both north and south. The Germans had hoped for a quick victory. Instead, they found themselves facing American resolve and superior logistics. As the battle wore on, German fuel ran out, their air force proved unable to establish air superiority, and American reserves continued to flow into the combat zone. By early January, the German offensive had been halted and then rolled back. The Ardennes gamble had failed, and the German army had exhausted its capacity to launch major offensive operations. The Ardennes offensive, despite its initial shock, confirmed something Eisenhower had come to understand. The Germans had no answer to American industrial capacity and the coordination that he had built among his commanders. The failure at Ardennes was also the final demonstration that German collapse was inevitable. Eisenhower could see the path now: hold Germany down in the west while Soviet forces pressed from the east, and the German state would collapse. The question was not whether Germany would be defeated, but how many casualties would be inflicted before it accepted that defeat. The race toward the Rhine would resume. The crossing would be opposed but ultimately successful. Germany would be conquered, and Eisenhower would be faced with the challenge of victory and occupation. But that was a problem for a different chapter of his life. For now, in January 1945, his job was to drive relentlessly toward the heart of Germany, to coordinate with his often fractious commanders, and to maintain the discipline and cohesion of the greatest military force ever assembled under a single command. The man from Kansas had proven that leadership in war was not about brilliant tactics, but about the capacity to think clearly under chaos, to trust the men beneath you, and to maintain focus on the ultimate objective when the world around you is burning. By the start of 1945, the map of Europe had become a canvas of Allied momentum and Soviet advance. The Germans, squeezed between two worlds, faced annihilation. From the west, Eisenhower's armies pushed relentlessly after breaking out of the Ardennes nightmare. From the east, Stalin's Red Army thundered forward, claiming territory and peoples with each passing day. The Third Reich, once a sprawling continental empire, contracted into a shrinking fortress. Berlin itself lay somewhere ahead, a symbol of Nazi power, a prize both political and strategic. But who would claim it? This question, more than any other, would define the final months of the war in Europe and shape the recriminations that followed for decades. Eisenhower stood at a crossroads that few military commanders have faced. His armies stretched across Europe, numbering in the millions. American, British, Canadian, Free French, and Polish forces answered to his command. Supply lines ran from the Atlantic back to ports in France and Belgium. Every ton of ammunition, every gallon of fuel, every replacement soldier flowed through a logistical system that Eisenhower had spent years building. Yet the closer his forces drew to Germany proper, the more the political calculations shifted. The war was ending. The question of what came after was beginning to dominate the thinking of Roosevelt and Churchill, and it hung over Eisenhower's shoulders like a weight he could not shake. Stalin wanted Berlin. Eisenhower knew this. The Soviet dictator had lost more soldiers than any leader in human history. The Red Army had bled across Eastern Europe. For Stalin, capturing the Nazi capital was not merely military victory. It was validation, compensation, revenge. In early February, Eisenhower met with Roosevelt and Churchill at Yalta, a seaside resort in Crimea. Stalin was there too. The three leaders spoke of how to end the war, how to occupy Germany, how to prevent another catastrophe in Europe. Churchill argued for a swift push by the Western Allies toward Berlin. He wanted to prevent Soviet forces from dominating Central and Eastern Europe entirely. But Roosevelt, weakened by age and illness, seemed reluctant to press the issue, and Eisenhower himself, whether by conviction or deference, had already begun thinking about the problem differently. His military advisors, particularly his planners in the field, had calculated the cost. A direct assault on Berlin would be expensive in American and British lives. The Soviets, they reasoned, had already committed millions of soldiers to the Eastern Front. Let them pay the price for Berlin. This logic was not without merit militarily, but it carried political consequences that no one fully appreciated at the time. By March 1945, Eisenhower's forces were positioned along the Rhine, the last great natural barrier before the heart of Germany. The British under Montgomery prepared their assault on the northern sector. The Americans, under Omar Bradley, massed their forces in the center and south. Eisenhower visited the Rhine himself, looking across the gray water at the German forests beyond. Months of fighting still lay ahead, everyone knew. The Germans, cornered and desperate, had shown they would fight to the last. Fanatical SS units still roamed the countryside. Wehrmacht formations, though fractured and depleted, still possessed teeth. Some Allied planners predicted the war in Europe might last into summer, even autumn. Yet Eisenhower also knew that the end was inevitable. It was no longer a question of whether the Nazis would fall, but when and under what circumstances. On the 24th of March, Eisenhower launched his Rhine crossing. The operation was a masterpiece of coordination. Heavy bombers pounded the German side. Artillery thundered. Engineers threw pontoons across the water while assault boats ferried troops to the far shore. The British and Canadians attacked in the north. The Americans surged across in multiple places along the river's length. German resistance crumbled faster than many had predicted. The Wehrmacht was broken. Its supply lines were severed. The Luftwaffe, once a feared adversary, had been driven from the skies and no longer appeared. Within days, hundreds of thousands of Allied troops poured across the Rhine. Tank columns raced into the German countryside. Advancing soldiers found themselves in a world of small villages, farmland, and forests. Germany itself lay before them, vulnerable and disintegrating. At this moment, a decision had to be made about the direction of the advance. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery argued vehemently for a concentrated drive northward and then eastward, a single knife thrust toward Berlin. Montgomery believed that divided efforts meant delay. He wanted one massive army group to strike at the Nazi capital with overwhelming force. But Eisenhower saw it differently. His instinct, shaped by months of managing coalition warfare, was toward a broad front. American generals like Omar Bradley and George S. Patton chafed under Montgomery's assumption of superiority. Eisenhower did not trust a concentrated strategy that gave one British commander primacy. Beyond personality and pride, however, there was a more fundamental calculation. Eisenhower believed that the best use of Allied forces was to strike simultaneously from multiple directions, to prevent any German concentration of reserves. And perhaps most crucially, he had already decided that Berlin was not his principal objective. That honor, he believed, belonged to the Soviets. This decision became the source of enormous controversy that would echo through historical debates for generations. In late March and early April, as American forces raced eastward, Eisenhower halted some of them short of Berlin. He redirected others southward toward Bavaria and southern Germany, where intelligence suggested German forces might make a last stand. Meanwhile, he sent only limited forces northward toward the German capital. Messages arrived from Stalin. The Soviet dictator wanted to know where the Allies intended to drive. Eisenhower replied that his forces would advance to the Elbe River, stopping short of Berlin. This line would be the boundary between East and West, between Soviet advance and American occupation. Stalin expressed satisfaction with this arrangement, which was not true. Soviet forces, moving with brutal speed, were already driving toward Berlin from the east. The Soviets would reach the city first. They would take Berlin. It was not generosity on Eisenhower's part that gave them this prize, but rather a calculation about costs and benefits. When Eisenhower explained his reasoning, he cited military logic. Berlin, he argued, was no longer a strategic objective, but a political symbol. The war in Europe was essentially won. German forces were dissolving. Continuing to feed more American soldiers into a costly street-by-street assault on a massive city would mean unnecessary casualties. The Soviets, already committed to the Eastern Front, were well positioned to absorb the cost. This logic had coherence, but it overlooked a more troubling reality. By allowing the Soviets to take Berlin unchallenged, Eisenhower was making a statement about the post-war order. He was signaling that the Soviets would dominate Eastern Europe. He was accepting, tacitly, that the Soviets would liberate Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and other nations, not American or British forces. The political consequences were profound, though they would only become fully apparent in the months and years that followed. Yet Eisenhower's attention was not truly on Berlin at all. Instead, he focused on what he believed was a genuine military threat, the possibility of a German national redoubt, a vast fortress in the Alps where Nazi fanatics might make a prolonged final stand. Intelligence reports, some of them later proven false or exaggerated, spoke of German fortifications in southern Germany and Austria. Eisenhower feared that German forces would retreat south, regroup in mountainous terrain, and prolong the war indefinitely. To prevent this catastrophe, he redirected significant forces southward. American and French armies pushed into Bavaria and Austria. They were not heading toward Berlin. They were moving toward mountains and defensive positions that, in the end, proved either non-existent or quickly abandoned by German forces too desperate to mount organized resistance. As April unfolded, the end came in a rush. German cities fell daily. Soviet troops burst into Berlin itself, beginning a brutal urban battle that would last 2 weeks. American forces crossed the Elbe and met Soviet forces in the middle. German soldiers, no longer willing to die for a dying regime, surrendered by the thousands. The Third Reich, which had promised 1,000 years, collapsed after 12. On the 8th of May, Germany signed the instrument of unconditional surrender. The war in Europe was over. Eisenhower did not occupy Berlin. He did not preside over the fall of the Nazi regime. Instead, he stood aside and allowed others to claim the prize. Some called this wisdom. Others called it a strategic blunder of historical proportions. The criticism came swiftly, particularly from British quarters. Churchill and his advisors had warned that allowing the Soviets to dominate Eastern Europe would create problems for decades. They were right. Montgomery himself believed that Eisenhower had missed an opportunity to prevent Soviet expansion, that a more aggressive strategy could have resulted in Western forces controlling Berlin and the surrounding territory. Whether this was militarily feasible remains debated by historians to this day. What is not debated is the consequence. The line that Eisenhower accepted, the Elbe River as the boundary between Soviet and American occupation zones, became the line that would split Europe for the next 45 years. The Iron Curtain descended along that line. Eastern Europe fell under Soviet domination. Millions of people who might have lived under Western influence instead lived under communist rule for generations. Eisenhower himself, in later years, defended his decision. He argued that he was a military commander, not a political one. His job was to defeat Nazi Germany with minimum loss of American lives. By accepting that the Soviets would take Berlin, he achieved both objectives. The war in Europe ended. American casualties remained lower than they might have been in a costly assault on the German capital. He followed his military logic, applied his calculations of cost and benefit, and made his choice. Yet the consequences of military decisions inevitably ripple into the political sphere. Eisenhower understood this intellectually, but perhaps did not fully grasp the magnitude of the transformation he was allowing to unfold. The Grand Alliance that had united against Hitler was already fracturing. The Soviets were already claiming their prize. The post-war world was already taking shape, and when it did, it would be a divided world, separated by a line that Eisenhower had agreed to, a line between systems that would wage a Cold War for the better part of a century. On the 8th of May, 1945, Germany lay in unconditional surrender. The guns that had thundered across Europe for nearly 6 years fell silent. In a small schoolhouse in the French city of Reims, German military representatives signed the instrument of capitulation before representatives of the United States, the Soviet Union, and Britain. Eisenhower did not attend the ceremony himself. He sent his subordinates to witness the formality while he remained at his headquarters, understanding that the moment belonged not to him, but to the millions who had fought and died to bring it about. Yet, when the news reached him that evening, he understood with absolute clarity what had transpired. His assignment to command the greatest military coalition in history had achieved its objective. The Third Reich, which had seemed invincible only 5 years earlier, had been crushed into rubble and ash. The man who had risen from obscurity in the plains of Kansas now stood as the architect of Nazi Germany's destruction. But victory, Eisenhower would soon discover, was not an ending. It was a threshold. As the celebrations erupted across the liberated territories of Europe, in London and Paris and Brussels, in the liberated camps of the East where survivors stumbled into the light, Eisenhower received his next assignment, one more grave and morally complex than any battle he had fought. He was appointed military governor of the American zone of occupied Germany, a role that would require him to govern a defeated nation of more than 60 million people, manage the logistics of feeding them through a winter of deprivation, preside over the detention and trial of war criminals, and begin rebuilding the institutions of a shattered state. The man who had spent his career moving armies across battlefields would now find himself administering the consequences of military victory, a task that demanded not the warrior's instinct but the statesman's judgment. The Germany that Eisenhower's forces entered was a world of utter devastation. Cities that had stood for centuries were reduced to skeletal remains. Hamburg and Dresden, Frankfurt and Cologne, entire urban cores had been pulverized by years of relentless bombing and final assault. Homeless populations numbered in the millions, wandering roads clogged with debris and unexploded ordnance. Agricultural production had collapsed, transportation networks were severed, and the basic infrastructure of modern life, water systems, electricity grids, hospitals, had been systematically destroyed either by Allied bombing or by German scorched earth tactics in their retreat. The German people themselves were traumatized, starving, and in many cases unmoored from any moral or national identity. The Nazi apparatus had collapsed so completely that there existed a genuine vacuum of authority. It fell to Eisenhower and his military administration to fill that void with something resembling order and the beginnings of justice. What Eisenhower had not anticipated, what no military briefing could have fully prepared him for, was the discovery of the scale and systematic nature of the Holocaust. As American forces pushed into Germany in the spring of 1945, soldiers began liberating concentration camps and extermination facilities. The initial reports seemed almost impossible to believe. Whispered rumors, photographic evidence, survivor testimony, all converging on a truth so monstrous that even hardened soldiers recoiled in horror. At Dachau and Buchenwald, at Mauthausen and Bergen-Belsen, soldiers encountered the physical manifestation of industrial mass murder on a scale that had no parallel in human history. Skeletal figures, barely recognizable as human beings, emerged from the camps. Mass graves yielded their grim evidence. The meticulous German records, the obsessive documentation of murder that the Nazis had maintained with bureaucratic precision, provided irrefutable proof of the deliberate extermination of 6 million Jewish people and millions of others deemed undesirable by Nazi ideology. Eisenhower, confronted with this reality, made a decision that revealed his character. He ordered that soldiers and later civilians be brought to witness the camps firsthand. He personally toured camps and photographic evidence. He understood with the clarity of a man accustomed to seeing war's consequences that the world would need to see what had been done. that denial would fester if the truth remained abstract or questionable. His order to document everything, photographs, films, written testimonies, created a record that would make historical denial impossible. He wrote in his own hand to military commanders that the camps and their contents must be preserved as they were found, as physical evidence of crimes that demanded both justice and remembrance. In this decision, Eisenhower transcended the role of mere military administrator. He became, perhaps without fully realizing it, a guardian of historical truth against future deception. The political and administrative challenges that accompanied military governance were equally daunting. Eisenhower faced immediate questions about which Germans to employ in the reconstruction of government and society. Many administrators and technicians had been members of the Nazi Party, not necessarily its worst criminals, but complicit nonetheless in its machinery. Should they be excluded from all positions of authority, leaving the occupying forces to administer everything directly, a task that would require hundreds of thousands of American soldiers to remain indefinitely? Or should pragmatism dictate that certain individuals be retained to keep basic services functioning? Eisenhower navigated this dilemma with measured realism. He pursued what became known as denazification, a process of removing the most dangerous and ideologically committed Nazis from positions of authority, while allowing lesser party members to retain positions, particularly those critical to preventing chaos or starvation. It was a policy that satisfied no one completely. Purificans in Washington thought it too lenient. Germans thought it too punitive. But it reflected Eisenhower's fundamental belief that occupation could not be permanent, and that at some point, Germans would need to govern themselves. The question of justice for Nazi war crimes consumed Eisenhower's attention throughout his tenure as military governor. He fully supported the establishment of the International Military Tribunal, the unprecedented tribunal that would prosecute Nazi leaders for crimes against humanity, a legal category that many argued did not even exist before the trials began. Eisenhower understood that without formal justice, without the trials and the convictions and the sentences that would follow, the moral authority of the victors would be undermined. The trials needed to be scrupulous and transparent, allowing defendants their right to counsel and confrontation, establishing standards of evidence that would withstand historical scrutiny. The Nuremberg trials, which began in 1945 and stretched through 1946, prosecuted the highest-ranking Nazis still alive, Hermann Göring, Rudolf Hess, Albert Speer, and others who had shaped Nazi policy and executed its barbarities. Eisenhower's occupying forces provided the security, the facilities, and the necessary administrative support for these trials to proceed. He believed, correctly, that history would judge the occupation not merely by military victory, but by how the victors responded to criminal evil. Yet Eisenhower was also a pragmatist about Cold War realities. Even as he overshadowed war crimes prosecution, he was acutely aware that Germany now sat on the fault line between the Soviet Union and the Western Allies. The cooperation that had bound the American and Soviet armies together in the destruction of Nazi Germany was already fracturing into suspicion and hostility. The Soviet occupation zone, covering eastern Germany, was becoming something approaching a Soviet satellite state even before the war officially ended. Eisenhower understood that the long-term security of Europe would depend not on punishing Germany forever, but on integrating West Germany into a Western alliance structure that could counterbalance Soviet power. This calculation influenced his decisions about German reconstruction and policy. It meant allocating resources to feed Germans and begin rebuilding their economy, not from mercy, but from strategic necessity. It meant looking forward to a future in which Germany might be a partner in the defense of Western Europe, a proposition that would have seemed unimaginable in 1945, but which Eisenhower began to view as inevitable. The task of preventing starvation in occupied Germany during the winter of 1945 and into 1946 was itself a monumental undertaking. The German agricultural system had been devastated. Refugees from Eastern Europe were flooding into the American and British zones, fleeing the Soviet advance. American resources were strained between supplying its own occupation forces and preventing mass famine among the occupied population. There were voices in Washington, and among some in Eisenhower's own command, that argued for a hard line, that Germans should suffer the consequences of their aggression and their war crimes, that American soldiers should not consume resources to feed former enemies, while American families at home faced shortages. Eisenhower opposed this reasoning with quiet firmness. The war had ended, he argued, and humanity required that civilians, including German civilians, not be allowed to starve as punishment for their government's actions. The American occupation would be humane, or it would lose its moral authority. He allocated resources, ensured that American supplies flowed into German communities, and began the process of making Germans responsible for their own sustenance through organized labor and economic reconstruction. By 1948, when Eisenhower finally stepped down as military governor and prepared to leave Germany, the American zone had been transformed from a world of chaos and rubble into something approximating stability and incipient recovery. Cities were being rebuilt, schools and hospitals reopened, civil administration was functioning. The most dangerous Nazi leaders had been tried and convicted. The Holocaust had been documented with meticulous precision. Refugees had been sorted and either repatriated or resettled. The groundwork had been laid for West Germany's eventual integration into the Western Alliance. It was not triumph. The occupation remained unpopular in America. The reconstruction remained incomplete, and many injustices remained unaddressed. But it represented something Eisenhower valued more than triumph: competent, humane administration of a catastrophic situation. What Eisenhower learned in Germany during those 3 years, though he rarely spoke of it directly, was that military victory and moral clarity are not the same thing. Armies win wars, but the aftermath of war demands something different. Patience, principle, pragmatism applied in equal measure, and the constant struggle between justice and stability. He had defeated Germany, but occupying it, governing it, preventing its people from becoming a resentful powder keg for the next conflict, that required wisdom that no military academy could teach. The destruction that Eisenhower had orchestrated as supreme commander had been necessary to defeat fascism, but what he now faced was the necessity of building something in its place, of showing a defeated people that there could be a future beyond revenge and hatred. It was work without glory, visible only to those who lived through it, and to historians who would study the period decades later. But it shaped Eisenhower's understanding of power, responsibility, and the true cost of military command in ways that would inform every decision he would make as a leader in the years ahead. The triumph in Europe had arrived at last. On the 8th of May, 1945, Germany signed its unconditional surrender. The bells of freedom rang across the continent. Cities that had endured years of bombardment now erupted in celebration. And yet, for Dwight Eisenhower, the war was not finished. The Pacific theater remained ablaze. Japan fought with a ferocity that seemed to defy all reason, and American planners estimated that the final assault on the Japanese homeland could cost hundreds of thousands more American lives. The question that hung over the euphoria of European victory was stark and unavoidable. What role would Eisenhower play in bringing the Pacific War to its close? The answer would prove far more complex than either Eisenhower or his superiors anticipated. In the weeks following the German surrender, Eisenhower found himself in a strange limbo. He was the supreme military figure of the European theater, celebrated as the architect of victory, yet the Pacific remained under the command of General Douglas MacArthur and Admiral Chester Nimitz. These two commanders had conducted their own war with their own strategies, and there was no clear mechanism for merging their operations with the force Eisenhower commanded. President Franklin Roosevelt had died on the 12th of April 1945, just weeks before the German collapse. Vice President Harry Truman, now president, faced decisions of extraordinary magnitude about how to conclude the war against Japan. Military planners presented him with estimates of casualties that ran into the hundreds of thousands should an invasion of the Japanese homeland become necessary. The closer American forces drew to Japan itself, the more ferocious the resistance became. The battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa had demonstrated that Japanese soldiers and civilians alike would fight to the death rather than surrender. Eisenhower, for his part, understood the weight of these calculations. He had orchestrated the greatest invasion in human history at Normandy. He had not forgotten the carnage. He had not forgotten the responsibility. By late spring of 1945, it became clear that Eisenhower would in fact be reassigned. The Joint Chiefs of Staff began discussing his redeployment to the Pacific as commander of American ground forces for the planned invasion of Japan, scheduled for November of 1945 at the earliest. The operation was codenamed Operation Downfall, and it was conceived as two phases: Operation Olympic, the invasion of Kyushu, the southernmost of Japan's main islands, and Operation Coronet, the subsequent invasion of Honshu and the assault on Tokyo itself. The scale of the operation dwarfed even Overlord. American planners projected that they would need to assemble nearly 2 million fighting men on the island of Kyushu alone. The logistical undertaking was staggering. Eisenhower began receiving briefings on the disposition of Japanese forces, on the terrain of the islands, on the supply requirements. He studied maps and unit strengths with the same methodical care he had applied to every operation in Europe. Yet even as he prepared for this new command, he carried a private conviction that the war might not last long enough for him to see battle in the Pacific. He could not have articulated why, but something told him that events were moving toward a climax that would overtake all military planning. That climax came on the 6th of August, 1945. An American aircraft designated Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima. Eisenhower had known the weapon existed. He had read classified reports about the Manhattan Project, but the reality of its use struck him with the force of a physical blow. 3 days later, a second atomic bomb fell on Nagasaki. In the aftermath of these catastrophic strikes, Japan announced its surrender. On the 15th of August, 1945, Emperor Hirohito broadcast the news to the Japanese people. The war was over. The formal Japanese surrender ceremony would take place aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on the 2nd of September 1945. Eisenhower would not attend that ceremony. General Douglas MacArthur would accept the surrender on behalf of the United States and the Allied powers. Instead, Eisenhower remained in Europe, overseeing the final consolidation of the occupation and the demobilization of American forces. For Eisenhower, the atomic bombing presented a moral and strategic puzzle that would occupy his thinking for the remainder of his life. He had not been consulted about the decision to use the weapon. The choice had been made at the highest levels of government, by men who weighed the incalculable cost of a conventional invasion against the unprecedented destruction of a single stroke. In his later years, Eisenhower would express ambivalence about the decision. He believed that Japan was already on the verge of collapse, that the Soviet entry into the war against Japan, which occurred on the 9th of August, had tipped the scales decisively toward surrender. He questioned whether the atomic bomb had been necessary to end the fighting, or whether it had been employed for other reasons, to demonstrate American power to a watching world, to establish a new balance of influence in the Pacific theater, to shape the peace that would follow. Yet he did not voice these doubts publicly at the time. He was a military officer, not a politician, and he understood that such questions were above his station. He focused instead on the practical matters of victory and occupation. The weeks following Japan's surrender were consumed by the machinery of demobilization and celebration. American forces in the Pacific, numbering in the millions, had to be transported home, paid out, and reintegrated into civilian life. The logistical challenge was enormous. Ships that had carried soldiers to distant battlefields now had to carry them back. The American public demanded the swift return of their sons and brothers and husbands. Eisenhower, meanwhile, remained in Europe, where similar demobilization challenges confronted him. But more than logistics occupied his attention. The occupation of Germany was becoming a consuming responsibility. American forces would remain in Germany for years, serving as an army of occupation, administering a defeated nation, dealing with the displaced persons who had been liberated from concentration camps and labor camps. These responsibilities were grim and grinding, devoid of the clarity of combat. Eisenhower had to transform himself from a war commander into a military governor, from a man whose success was measured in battles won into a man whose success would be measured in order maintained and reconstruction accomplished. Yet across America and Europe, Eisenhower's image had become something far larger than any specific military task. He was the man who had defeated Hitler. He was the general who had held together a fractious coalition, who had made the hard decisions, who had landed at Normandy despite the risks and uncertainties. Parades and ceremonies greeted him everywhere he went. He was invited to address Congress. He received letters by the tens of thousands from citizens expressing their gratitude. The contrast between Eisenhower's modest demeanor and his towering reputation created a curious tension. He had never sought acclaim. He had done his duty, executed his orders, made decisions based on military necessity, and yet the world insisted on elevating him into something more, a symbol of American power, a representative of the triumph of democracy over tyranny, a military leader who had proven that competence and character could achieve extraordinary things. Eisenhower accepted these accolades with grace, but he did not mistake them for approval of any particular philosophy or ideology. He had won a war. What would come next remained to be written. The transition from war to peace was proving far more complicated than anyone had anticipated. The Soviet Union, America's ally in the struggle against Nazi Germany, was revealing itself to be a different sort of problem. Stalin's intentions in Eastern Europe were becoming increasingly clear. Soviet forces occupied Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and other territories. The Iron Curtain, in Winston Churchill's memorable phrase, was descending across Europe. The alliance that had been forged in the furnace of war was fracturing almost as soon as victory had been achieved. Eisenhower found himself and his military judgment increasingly drawn into these political calculations. He was consulted about troop dispositions, about how many American soldiers would remain in Europe, about whether American forces should withdraw entirely or maintain a garrison. These were not military questions alone. They were political questions, wearing a military uniform. The post-war world would not be the simple peace that Americans had imagined during the long, dark years of war. It would be a prolonged standoff, a contest without conventional battles, a struggle for influence and ideology that would occupy Eisenhower's attention for the remainder of his career. In the immediate aftermath of victory, however, such complexities seemed remote. Americans wanted to celebrate. They had won. The evil of Nazi Germany had been destroyed. Japan had surrendered. American boys were coming home. Eisenhower embodied that victory. When he traveled through liberated European cities, crowds gathered to cheer him. When he appeared in public, people reached out to touch him, to thank him, to affirm that his leadership had been worthy and right. He received visitors in his modest quarters in Frankfurt, where he had established his command post. Officers and soldiers sought him out to pay their respects. Political leaders from across Europe visited to express their nation's gratitude. Eisenhower conducted these encounters with courtesy and humility, but there was something almost bewildered in his bearing. He was a man designed for the clarity of military command, and that clarity was rapidly evaporating. What did one do with victory? How did one maintain order in a shattered continent? How did one navigate the sudden emergence of new threats and complications? The specific question of what to do with Eisenhower himself became a matter of increasing interest in American political circles. The general had become the most celebrated military figure in the nation. Polls showed him beloved by the American public. Politicians began to view him with interest that went beyond military matters. Republican leaders, in particular, began to wonder whether Eisenhower might be interested in political office. The general consistently deflected such inquiries. He was a soldier, he insisted, not a politician. His duty was to the military and to the nation in its military capacity, yet he was growing conscious of the fact that military duty itself was being redefined. The war was over, but the world was not at peace. The Soviet threat was ascending even as the German and Japanese threats had been vanquished. Eisenhower sensed that his military career would not end with the simple fact of victory. There was more to come, more decisions to be made, more responsibilities to be shouldered. The full implications of that realization would take time to emerge, but the seeds were already planted in the months following the Japanese surrender. By the end of 1945, Eisenhower had become perhaps the most admired American alive. Presidents came and went, but Eisenhower's reputation only seemed to grow. He was untarnished by politics, uncomplicated by controversy, unburdened by the messy compromises that consumed ordinary public figures. He was simply the man who had won the war, and in a nation exhausted by conflict and uncertainty, that was an enormous asset. He did not yet recognize it, but Eisenhower was being prepared for a role that would extend far beyond military command. The same qualities that had made him an effective supreme commander, his ability to manage competing egos, to build consensus, to find practical middle ground between conflicting viewpoints, would serve him in ways he could not yet imagine. The boy from Kansas who had dreamed of military service, who had spent decades in obscurity watching others gain glory, had finally achieved a kind of triumph. But triumph, he was beginning to understand, was not an ending. It was a transition. The war had ended. The real test was only beginning. Victory tastes different when you must administer it. Dwight Eisenhower arrived in Germany in the summer of 1945, not as a conqueror seeking spoils, but as an occupier inheriting an apocalypse. The Third Reich lay in rubble. Cities that had stood for centuries were reduced to sordid piles of brick and ash. The German economy had collapsed into barter and desperation. Millions of displaced persons wandered the roads, prisoners freed from camps, refugees fleeing the Soviet advance, families separated by war and genocide. Eisenhower's task was not merely to accept Germany's surrender, but to govern a nation of 80 million traumatized people, disarm an enemy that had fought to its last breath, and do so while managing an alliance with the Soviet Union that was already fracturing at its seams. The general who had unified armies in battle now had to unify a shattered society under occupation. It was a command unlike any he had known. Eisenhower established his headquarters and began the work of military governance with the same methodical approach that had characterized his approach to war. He divided Germany into 4 occupation zones: American, British, French, and Soviet, each administered by its respective Allied commander. Eisenhower's American zone included Bavaria and much of the industrialized Ruhr Valley, the economic heart of German manufacturing. His responsibility was staggering. He had to feed a population that had no means to feed itself. He had to restore basic services, electricity, water, transportation, in cities where infrastructure had been deliberately destroyed. He had to identify and arrest Nazi war criminals, a process that demanded both relentless investigation and impossible moral judgment. He had to manage millions of soldiers, many of them eager to return home after years away from their families, and he had to do all of this while maintaining order, preventing chaos, and beginning the long process of denazification, stripping German society of Nazi ideology and rebuilding its institutions from the foundation upward. The scale of human suffering was almost incomprehensible to those who had not witnessed it directly. Eisenhower visited the concentration camps that his armies had liberated. He walked through Buchenwald. He saw the skeletal remains of prisoners, the methodical records of murder, the gas chambers, the crematoriums. The reality of industrial genocide struck him with a force that transcended military strategy or political calculation. He understood, in that moment, that this was not merely a defeated enemy to be administered, but evidence of a civilization that had descended into moral abyss. He ordered photographs to be taken. He documented everything. Later, he would insist that the world see what he had seen, that denying or forgetting the Holocaust would become impossible. His military occupation of Germany was therefore not simply about political control or economic reconstruction. It was about bearing witness to history's darkest hour and ensuring that such darkness could never be repeated. Yet even as Eisenhower confronted these immediate humanitarian crises, a larger shadow was moving across Eastern Europe. The Soviet Union, which had sacrificed more blood and treasure than any Allied power in defeating Nazi Germany, was consolidating control over the territories its armies had liberated. Stalin's forces occupied Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Eastern Germany. The Soviets were not disarming and withdrawing. They were establishing puppet governments, arresting democratic leaders, and making clear that they intended to maintain permanent military presence in the territories they had conquered. Eisenhower, watching this consolidation with mounting alarm, began to understand that the enemy he had defeated in war was rapidly being replaced by a rival who had been nominally an ally. The friendship born in the forge of shared struggle against Nazi Germany was evaporating almost as quickly as the smoke cleared from the battlefields. Eisenhower's perspective on the Soviet threat hardened considerably during these occupation years. He had been willing, during the war, to tolerate Stalin's brutality as the price of defeating a common enemy. He had accepted Soviet territorial ambitions in Eastern Europe as a practical reality of military geography and the enormous sacrifice the Soviets had endured. But by 1946 and 1947, he was convinced that Soviet communism represented a fundamental threat to the stability and security of Europe. He began advocating for a hard line against Soviet expansion. He supported the creation of a unified defense structure for the western zones of Germany. He recommended that American forces maintain significant presence on the continent, rather than demobilizing entirely, as pressure from Congress and the American public demanded. He believed that only sustained military deterrence could prevent Soviet aggression. In letters to military colleagues and in classified assessments to political leadership, Eisenhower became one of the most prominent voices warning against Soviet intentions. The question of German reparations and reconstruction became central to Cold War strategy. Some American policymakers, including Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau, had proposed deliberately keeping Germany economically weak after the war, destroying its industrial capacity and ensuring it could never again pose a military threat. Eisenhower recognized the moral logic of this approach. Germany had initiated aggressive war, had conquered and plundered its neighbors, and deserved punishment. But he also understood that an economically destroyed Germany would create a vacuum into which Soviet influence would inevitably flow. Desperate, hungry, hopeless Germans might look toward communism as their only path to recovery and dignity. Eisenhower therefore became an unlikely advocate for German recovery. He supported policies that would gradually rebuild the German economy, create employment, and restore a functioning society. This position put him at odds with those who wanted to exact maximum punishment from Germany, and it foreshadowed the Marshall Plan that would later reconstruct Western Europe. Eisenhower saw the geopolitical reality before many others. A prosperous, stable, Western-oriented Germany was essential to checking Soviet power. Vengeance had to be balanced against strategy. Eisenhower's role as military governor also forced him to confront the practical challenges of denazification. How do you remove an ideology from a society where that ideology had been systematically embedded into schools, universities, bureaucracies, and culture for 12 years? Do you prosecute every Nazi Party member and remove them from all positions of authority, knowing that this would eliminate vast numbers of engineers, doctors, teachers, and administrators necessary to keep society functioning? Or do you accept lesser participation in Nazi Party structures as the price of maintaining administrative continuity? Eisenhower adopted a pragmatic approach that prioritized immediate stability and functioning government over absolute ideological purification. This decision was controversial then and remains debated by historians now. Some argue that Eisenhower was too lenient, allowing too many Nazis to escape accountability and remain in positions of influence. Others contend that his approach was the only realistic way to prevent complete societal collapse and the descent into Soviet-controlled chaos. The tension between justice and pragmatism, between punishment and reconstruction, defined his occupation policy. The Soviet presence in adjacent occupation zones became an increasingly tense reality. Eisenhower's American soldiers and Soviet soldiers were in close proximity, occupying the same country, nominally allies but increasingly aware that they represented fundamentally opposed political systems and strategic interests. Incidents of tension occurred regularly: disputes over occupation boundaries, disagreements about prisoner repatriation, conflicts over the administration of Berlin, which lay deep in the Soviet zone but was itself divided into 4 Allied sectors. Eisenhower had to manage these incidents with careful diplomacy, maintaining military preparedness while avoiding direct confrontation. He knew that at any moment, a miscalculation or a hot-headed commander on either side could spark a confrontation that might escalate into military conflict. The Cold War was not yet called by that name, but it was becoming a lived reality in the occupation of Germany. Every decision Eisenhower made had to account for Soviet reaction. Every military deployment, every policy announcement, every administrative choice had implications for the emerging confrontation with the Soviet Union. By 1948, it was clear that the occupation of Germany and the entire framework of Allied cooperation was fragmenting into Cold War division. Germany itself would soon be formally divided. The American, British, and French zones would merge into a Western German state aligned with the Western powers. The Soviet zone would become East Germany, firmly under Soviet control and incorporated into the emerging Eastern Bloc. Eisenhower's occupation command gradually transitioned into military governance of the Western zones exclusively. His role as Supreme Commander of occupied Germany was coming to an end, but his influence over European strategy was about to expand dramatically. The European allies, alarmed by Soviet power and the withdrawal of American demobilization pressures, began calling for a permanent American military commitment to European defense. The answer would be NATO, and Eisenhower would be the one called upon to build it. Eisenhower's years as military governor had transformed his understanding of global strategy. He had arrived in Germany in 1945, still partly shaped by his military experience in war, thinking in terms of campaigns, offensives, and decisive battles. He was leaving Germany in 1948, shaped by his experience in occupation and Cold War, thinking in terms of alliances, deterrence, and long-term strategic competition. He had learned that war could be won militarily, but required political and economic victory to be sustained. He had seen that ideology could not be defeated by armies alone, only by demonstrating superior material prosperity and functioning governance. He had understood that the Soviet Union, while a wartime ally, was becoming the central strategic threat to the American-led international order. These lessons would define his subsequent role as NATO Supreme Commander and later as President of the United States. The practical challenges of military governance had also taught Eisenhower something about the limits of military power. Tanks could not rebuild cities. Soldiers could not create functioning economies. Generals could not resolve the fundamental tensions between ideologies or erase centuries of cultural and political division. Military strength was necessary to provide the foundation for reconstruction and recovery, but it was not sufficient. This realization made Eisenhower skeptical of military solutions to fundamentally political and economic problems. He was growing into a kind of strategic wisdom that would later distinguish his presidency, the understanding that force had its place in the world, but that over-reliance on military power reflected a failure of political imagination and prudence. The officer who had commanded millions in war was learning that the greatest challenges facing his nation might require something other than military answers. As Eisenhower prepared to leave Germany and assume his new role as NATO commander, He carried with him the weight of occupation and the lessons of confronting Soviet power directly. He had governed a defeated enemy, administered occupied territory, and begun the long process of rebuilding a shattered society, while simultaneously recognizing that his wartime ally was becoming his greatest strategic competitor. He had advocated for strength against the Soviets while also recognizing that strength alone would not suffice to create a stable world. He had learned that the end of war did not mean the end of conflict, but rather a transformation of that conflict into forms that required different kinds of leadership and strategy. The general who had conquered Germany was now the architect of the alliance that would contain the Soviet Union for the next 4 decades. His time as military governor had been the crucible in which his Cold War strategy was forged. By 1950, the map of Europe had begun to harden. The Soviet Union, having bled and sacrificed more than any nation to defeat Hitler, had not withdrawn its armies eastward as the West had hoped. Instead, Stalin's grip tightened across Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and the eastern zones of occupied Germany. The Iron Curtain, as Winston Churchill had named it 2 years earlier, was no longer a metaphor. It was concrete, barbed wire, and the threat of Soviet tanks. The West faced a choice that was as old as strategy itself: unite or fracture. And into this moment of existential uncertainty stepped Eisenhower. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization had been formally established the previous year, in 1949, as a collective security pact binding Western democracies together against Soviet expansion. But a treaty on paper was not an army. It was not a strategy. It was not yet a reality. The member nations, the United States, Canada, Britain, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Norway, Denmark, Portugal, and Italy, possessed armies that were separate, uncoordinated, and often skeptical of one another. The French still harbored resentment toward the Germans. The British remained wary of American dominance. The smaller nations feared being consumed by their larger neighbors, and all of them feared the raw military power of the Soviet Union, which had grown even more formidable with the detonation of its first atomic bomb in August of 1949. NATO needed not just a treaty, but a commander who could transform this fragile coalition into a unified force. In April of 1950, President Truman offered Eisenhower the position of Supreme Commander of NATO. It was a role that would require him to live part of the year in Europe, coordinating military strategy across national boundaries, navigating diplomatic minefields that made the politics of wartime coalition look simple by comparison. Eisenhower was 59 years old, and he had hoped to spend his remaining years in a role of quieter authority, perhaps as Army Chief of Staff, a position of institutional prestige without the grinding chaos of active command. But when Truman spoke to him of the stakes, of the genuine risk that a Soviet attack could come without warning, of the need for a figure of unquestioned standing who could bind the Western alliance together, Eisenhower accepted. He accepted because he understood something that peacetime commanders often forget: that power without unity is no power at all. Eisenhower moved to Paris, establishing Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe, or SHAPE, in a sprawling compound that would become the nerve center of Western military coordination. Here, for the first time since the victory in Europe 5 years earlier, he gathered around him generals and officers from a dozen nations. But the atmosphere was profoundly different from the wartime alliance. Then there had been an enemy so obvious, so threatening, that cooperation flowed almost naturally from the necessity of survival. Now there were subtler tensions. Each nation wanted to preserve its own military independence. Each feared that NATO was merely a cover for American hegemony. Each worried that in a conflict with the Soviet Union, their own territory would become the battlefield. And each had memories, some of them humiliating, most of them painful, from the Second World War that made trust fragile. Eisenhower's method for binding this coalition was not the method of force or ultimatum, but of personal trust. He had learned during the war that a commander's authority derived not from rank alone, but from character. He moved among the European capitals, London, Bonn, Rome, Brussels, The Hague, listening more than speaking, understanding each nation's concerns, each commander's pride, each government's constraints. He met with French generals who remembered the fall of 1940 and harbored doubts about German rearmament. He spoke with German politicians who were still humiliated by defeat and skeptical that the West genuinely wanted them as full partners. He reassured smaller nations that had every right to fear being sacrificed in a larger game. He did not promise them victory because he knew that kind of promise was hollow. Instead, he offered them clarity about what unity meant and why it mattered more than their individual grievances. The fundamental strategic challenge Eisenhower faced was this: how to defend Europe without either bankrupting the American economy or ceding military initiative to the Soviet Union. The Soviet threat was real, but it was also undefined. No one could say with certainty whether Stalin intended to attack Western Europe in the near term or whether his strategy was one of indefinite pressure, using military intimidation to prevent European recovery and keep the continent in a state of anxious paralysis. Eisenhower believed that the Soviets respected strength and would test weakness. Therefore, NATO's posture had to be one of credible deterrence, enough military power, properly integrated and positioned, to make any aggressor think twice. But it also had to be sustainable, because this was not going to be a short conflict. The Cold War, as people were beginning to call it, might last for decades. To achieve this, Eisenhower worked toward what he called an integrated military command. Officers from different nations would serve directly under one commander, rather than simply coordinating through liaison officers. National pride was wounded by this proposal. The French, in particular, resisted the idea of their armies being subordinate to an American general, even Eisenhower, but he persisted with a kind of gentle determination, explaining that integration did not mean the erasure of national identity, but the multiplication of national strength. What seemed to work in his favor was that his authority as a wartime commander gave him a legitimacy that no peacetime military figure could possess. He had already proven that he could command coalition forces successfully. He had not abused that power to favor Americans over others. He had shared authority generously with British commanders like Montgomery and with French commanders like de Lattre. The memory of that fairness gave him credibility. Eisenhower also understood that NATO could not succeed as a purely military endeavor. The alliance had to be rooted in something deeper, in shared values, in economic reconstruction, in the restoration of hope. He saw that Europe was still scarred by war and poverty. The Marshall Plan, which Truman's administration had launched 3 years earlier, was beginning to rebuild the continent, but recovery was fragile and incomplete. Eisenhower advocated not just for military spending, but for the economic integration that he believed would make war among European nations impossible in the future. He supported the emerging European coal and steel community, a small but significant step toward economic unity. He understood that a people, too desperate to survive, would not commit to the discipline that collective defense required. Therefore, he used his influence with American policymakers to ensure that defense spending was coupled with economic aid and investment. The integration of Germany into NATO was perhaps Eisenhower's most delicate and consequential task. The Federal Republic of Germany had been established the previous year, in 1949, but it existed under Allied occupation and heavy suspicion. Many Europeans, particularly the French, could not imagine accepting German soldiers back into a collective defense force only 5 years after the end of the war. And yet Eisenhower recognized what others found difficult to acknowledge, that without German manpower and German industrial capacity, NATO could not generate enough military strength to deter the Soviet Union. And he approached this problem with characteristic patience, allowing the German government under Chancellor Konrad Adenauer to prove its democratic credentials and its commitment to Western values. He also made clear that German rearmament would happen not as a restoration of German military power, but as an addition to a genuinely integrated Western force. This framing allowed the French to accept something they would have violently rejected only months before. By 1951, Eisenhower had established the basic structure that would define NATO for decades to come. Member nations appointed military representatives to a standing organization. A military committee met regularly. Integrated commands were created for different geographical regions, each with multinational staffs. Plans were drawn up for the defense of Europe, including contingencies for conflict at every conceivable point along the Iron Curtain. The organization was not perfect. National interests still sometimes overrode alliance commitments. Disagreements about strategy and burden sharing erupted regularly. But for the first time since the Soviet threat had become explicit, Europe had a coordinated military response, and the command of that response lay with a figure who was trusted not because he was American, but because he was Eisenhower. What is often overlooked in the historical record is that during his NATO years, Eisenhower also maintained significant influence over American military strategy as a whole. He was not merely a subordinate to the Secretary of Defense or the Joint Chiefs of Staff, but rather a figure whose counsel was sought on questions of nuclear strategy, on the positioning of American forces around the world, on the proper role of the military in American Cold War policy. His voice was conservative. He advocated for measured rearmament rather than runaway military spending, for diplomacy as a complement to military strength rather than a substitute for it, for a clear-eyed understanding of what military power could and could not accomplish. These views sometimes put him at odds with more aggressive voices within the American military and political establishment, but his reputation gave them weight. The position also changed Eisenhower in ways that would become apparent only later. It removed him further from the daily operations of command and brought him into the realm of grand strategy and political persuasion. It taught him that military power, however great, was only one tool among many available to a national leader. It showed him the exhausting complexity of trying to hold together an alliance of nations with divergent interests and histories, and it began to plant in his mind doubts about whether an ever-expanding military establishment was truly in the national interest. These doubts would find their most famous expression 6 years later, at the end of his presidency, but their seeds were sown during these NATO years, in the constant struggle to balance deterrence with restraint, to build strength without promoting the militarization of the entire society. By 1952, Eisenhower had been Supreme Commander of NATO for nearly 2 years, and the organization had grown from a promising concept into a functioning military alliance. The forces under his nominal command were still far smaller than Soviet forces in Europe, but they were no longer utterly vulnerable. Morale had improved. Training was becoming standardized. Trust among the officers of different nations had deepened. And the Soviet Union, watching this unfold, had begun to calculate more carefully the costs of any aggressive move in Europe. This was perhaps Eisenhower's greatest achievement in the position, not that he defeated any enemy, but that by creating the appearance and reality of Western unity and strength, he made defeat less likely. But even as NATO took shape, the Korean War was dragging on, the American people were growing weary of constant military vigilance, and the Republican Party was preparing to recruit Eisenhower for a mission he had never sought, the presidency of the United States. America in 1952 was a nation exhausted. The Second World War had ended 7 years before, promising peace and prosperity, but instead, the country found itself locked in a grinding conflict in Korea, a distant peninsula that few Americans could locate on a map. Young men were being drafted, sent across the Pacific to fight and die for reasons that grew increasingly murky as the months stretched into years. The initial fervor of 1950, when North Korean forces invaded the South, had curdled into frustration. By 1952, the Korean War had claimed more than 30,000 American lives, with no clear end in sight. Stalemate had replaced momentum. The American public, which had endured depression and global war, now craved something their leaders could not provide: stability, normalcy, a return to the America that existed before the weight of the world settled onto their shoulders. The Republican Party, out of power since 1932, sensed opportunity in this exhaustion. They needed a candidate who could credibly promise not just victory, but peace. They needed a national hero, untainted by politics, someone the American people trusted absolutely. That man was Dwight Eisenhower. By 1952, Eisenhower was the supreme commander of NATO, stationed in Europe, building the alliance structure that would define the Cold War for the next 4 decades. He was revered across the Atlantic as the architect of victory in the Second World War. In America, his fame transcended politics. Republicans and Democrats alike acknowledged his strategic brilliance and his steady temperament. When party leaders began approaching him in 1951 about the presidency, they were asking him to undertake something he had never sought: political office. Eisenhower was not a politician. He was a soldier, a man who had spent his life following orders and executing missions with discipline and clarity. The prospect of entering the political arena, of becoming entangled in the machinery of elections and parties and compromises, filled him with something approaching dread. He had seen enough of politics in his years as Supreme Commander to know that it was a realm where clarity of purpose was blurred by coalition building and competing interests. His hesitation was genuine. When asked directly about running, he demurred, insisting that his duty lay in Europe, that NATO needed him to remain focused on the Soviet threat. This was not false modesty. This was a man genuinely uncertain whether he possessed the temperament or desire for political life. Yet the Korean War worked like a persistent pressure, a constant reminder that the nation needed leadership beyond the Pentagon. The incumbent president, Harry Truman, had made decisions that satisfied neither hawks nor doves. His firing of General Douglas MacArthur in April 1951 for insubordination regarding strategy in Korea had created a political firestorm. MacArthur, the iconic figure from the Pacific War, had returned to America and testified before Congress in opposition to Truman's limited war strategy. The public had reacted with shock and division. Eisenhower, watching from his headquarters in NATO, understood the tension that Truman faced. Korea was not World War II. It was not a clear conflict between democracy and fascism, but a complicated proxy struggle in a place most Americans did not understand. Yet Eisenhower also knew that the American people needed resolution, that the psychological burden of indefinite conflict was corrosive. He began to shift his position. The questions from Republican leaders came more frequently. Eisenhower, who had been a registered Republican but had remained above partisan politics, found himself drawn toward the possibility that he might serve his country in a new capacity. Not because he wanted power, he had tasted enough of command to understand its burdens, but because his country seemed to need him. By late 1951 and early 1952, the pressure intensified. Republican leaders made clear that Eisenhower was their only viable candidate, that without him they could not defeat Truman or prevent the nomination of more ideologically rigid conservatives who might divide the party. Eisenhower's advisors, particularly his chief of staff, pressed him to consider the offer seriously. They argued that he had unique credibility with the American people, that he could campaign on a platform of ending the Korean War without appearing to be a defeatist or a warmonger. His military background gave him the authority to negotiate from strength. His reputation transcended partisan divides. In February 1952, Eisenhower announced his intention to seek the Republican nomination, though he did so from Europe, maintaining a certain distance from the campaign. He did not return to America to campaign actively, believing that a serving NATO commander should maintain focus on his military duties. His campaign was managed by others, including Senator Richard Nixon of California, who became his running mate. Eisenhower's strategy was to position himself as above the fray, as the reluctant hero whom circumstance had called forward. This was partly genuine reluctance and partly shrewd political theater. He understood that Americans were tired of partisan squabbling, that they wanted a president who seemed to stand outside normal politics, who would govern for all Americans rather than for party advantage. The Republican convention in July 1952 became a battleground between Eisenhower and Senator Robert Taft of Ohio, a deeply conservative candidate who embodied the isolationist wing of the party. Taft had supporters who controlled many convention delegates, yet Eisenhower's broader appeal to moderate Republicans and crossover Democrats proved decisive. On the first ballot, Eisenhower secured the nomination. His victory represented a fundamental shift in Republican politics. The party that had been led by isolationists and conservative hardliners was now placing its faith in a military internationalist who believed in collective security and active engagement with the world. Eisenhower's nomination was a rejection of the America First impulse that had defined Republican opposition to the Second World War. It was a recognition that the world had changed, that America could no longer retreat into fortress isolationism, that the Soviet threat required sustained commitment and alliance building. The Democratic Convention nominated incumbent President Truman. Then he withdrew from the race, and the nomination passed to Adlai Stevenson, the cerebral governor of Illinois. Stevenson was an intellectual and a skilled orator, but he lacked Eisenhower's military credentials and his popularity with ordinary Americans. The general campaign was brief and, from Eisenhower's perspective, notably successful. He returned to America to campaign actively, and wherever he appeared, crowds gathered in expressions of genuine affection. There was something almost mythic about his presence. He was the man who had led America to victory in Europe, who had managed the most complex military coalition in human history, who had faced down Hitler's armies. His campaign slogan was simple and devastatingly effective: "I like Ike." It captured a sentiment that transcended politics. Americans did like him, or at least they trusted him in a way they did not trust conventional politicians. On Korea, Eisenhower promised a peaceful resolution, though he was deliberately vague about how he would achieve it. This was calculated political strategy. By refusing to detail his approach, he allowed voters to project onto him their own hopes for peace. Conservatives believed he would escalate the war if necessary to achieve victory. Liberals believed he would negotiate a ceasefire and withdraw American forces. Both interpretations could not be simultaneously true, but Eisenhower's ambiguity allowed his coalition to hold together through Election Day. The Korean stalemate provided the backdrop for the campaign's emotional resonance. Mothers and fathers across America had sons and brothers fighting in a war that seemed to have no purpose, no clear objective, no visible end. When Eisenhower spoke about Korea, he spoke with the authority of a man who understood warfare, who knew its terrible cost, and who would not spend American lives frivolously. In October 1952, Eisenhower made a campaign visit to Korea itself, a calculated political move that generated enormous media attention. He was photographed in combat gear, speaking with troops, observing the front lines. The message was clear. He would not ask Americans to fight in a place where he himself was unwilling to go. He would not command from a distance, but would engage directly with the conflict. This was partly authentic. Eisenhower genuinely wanted to understand the situation on the ground, but it was also masterful political communication. He was reminding Americans of his credibility as a military leader, his willingness to share the burdens of war. On Election Day, November 4th, 1952, Americans voted decisively for Eisenhower. He won 39 of the 48 states and captured the presidency with 55% of the popular vote. The margin was substantial, a clear mandate from the American people. Eisenhower had succeeded in his final mission before entering the presidency. He had convinced the nation that he could deliver peace in Korea and stability at home. His victory represented something broader than a simple partisan triumph. It was a generational transition. The New Deal coalition that had dominated American politics since 1932 was fracturing. Eisenhower appealed to moderate voters, to independents, to Republicans who had been marginalized by the party's conservative wing. He won voters in the suburbs, that emerging middle-class terrain that would define American politics for the next generation. He won substantial support among African American voters, though his civil rights record would later become contested and complicated. He won because Americans were tired, and they believed that Eisenhower could restore order without compromising American interests. The transition between his election and his inauguration was notably smooth, almost anticlimactic by comparison to the heated campaign. Eisenhower resigned his NATO command and began the work of building his administration. He selected John Foster Dulles, an experienced diplomat and Republican operative, as Secretary of State. He chose George Humphrey as Secretary of the Treasury, signaling his intention to control government spending and balance the budget. The cabinet he assembled was dominated by businessmen and military officers, moderate conservatives who shared his belief in pragmatic governance and limited government activism. In his inaugural address on January 20, 1953, Eisenhower spoke of peace through strength, of the need for moral clarity in facing the communist threat, and of the importance of unity among free nations. He spoke as a soldier turned civilian leader, a man who understood the terrible cost of conflict, and therefore would pursue it only when absolutely necessary. The speech was less memorable than some inaugural addresses, but it captured the essence of his political philosophy: prudence, restraint, and the belief that military strength would deter aggression far more effectively than military action. Korea remained his immediate challenge. Within weeks of taking office, Eisenhower authorized military moves that suggested he was willing to escalate the war, including hints about the possible use of nuclear weapons. Whether these hints were genuine threats or calculated psychological pressure remains debated by historians. What is clear is that the Korean situation began moving toward resolution. By July 1953, an armistice agreement was negotiated that established a ceasefire and created a demilitarized zone between North and South Korea. The war had not been won decisively. No unified Korea emerged under Western-friendly leadership, but it had ended, and American troops would begin returning home. Eisenhower had delivered on the implicit promise of his campaign: peace, or at least the cessation of active combat. The American public, which had been exhausted by the war, greeted the armistice with relief rather than celebration. The objective was not victory, but respite, and respite was what had been delivered. His journey from obscurity to the pinnacle of power was now complete. The boy from Kansas, the West Point officer who had spent decades in unglamorous postings, the general who had mastered the complexities of coalition warfare, was now the leader of the free world's most powerful nation. What had begun in 1951 as reluctant consideration had become, by January 1953, the fulfillment of a new calling. Eisenhower had not sought the presidency, but he had answered the call when his nation needed him. He believed, with considerable justification, that he possessed unique credibility to navigate the Cold War, to maintain alliance relationships that had been forged in the crucible of the Second World War, and to provide the steady leadership that Americans craved after years of conflict and uncertainty. The path to the presidency had been winding and filled with hesitation, yet it had led him, as so much of his life had, to a position where the nation's fate rested partly on his decisions. The burden of that responsibility was immense, but it was a burden he had learned to carry across a lifetime of service. His presidency would define him as much as his military command had, and in unexpected ways, it would make him more complicated, more controversial, and ultimately more human than the godlike military leader of the war years had appeared to be. In January of 1953, Dwight David Eisenhower stood before the nation as its 34th president, his hand raised to the oath, his shoulders bearing a weight unlike any he had carried before. For 37 years, he had worn a uniform. He had commanded armies across continents, made decisions that altered the course of history, and learned the terrible arithmetic of warfare, how to balance lives against strategy, ambition against conscience. But now, in the cold morning air of Washington, he exchanged that uniform for a dark suit and promised to preserve and protect the Constitution of the United States. The crowd that gathered on the National Mall knew him as a war hero, the man who had defeated Hitler. Few understood what came next. A president who would spend 8 years resisting the very impulses that had defined his military life, the drive to act decisively, to crush enemies, to expand American power without hesitation. Instead, Eisenhower would choose a different path, one that puzzled his allies and confounded his critics. A presidency built on the paradox of power held in check. The first crisis awaited him immediately. In Korea, American soldiers were frozen into stalemate against communist forces. The war neither won nor conclusively lost, grinding into its third year with no resolution in sight. Eisenhower had campaigned on a promise to end it, and his incoming administration faced a stark choice: escalate the conflict, potentially expanding it into China or even using nuclear weapons, or negotiate a settlement that would seem like a compromise with communism. The political pressures were immense. His own party included powerful voices demanding total victory, men who saw negotiation as betrayal. Yet Eisenhower understood something that eluded many of his advisors, that Korea was a trap designed by geography and Cold War logic, a place where American military superiority could not translate into definitive triumph. He authorized his negotiators to signal, subtly and through diplomatic channels, that the United States might consider using tactical nuclear weapons if an armistice could not be reached. Whether this threat was genuine or a calculated bluff remains debated by historians, but it had an effect. In July of 1953, barely 6 months into his presidency, an armistice was signed near the 38th parallel.